Okay, let's go ahead and get started. 7:01. Jose, when you get a chance, put up the agenda. Okay, so we have two items on the agenda tonight. We have, and this is probably going to take up most of our time. Let's see how it goes and see if we can work through it. But we have our equity review tonight. So we're going to walk through each of the chapters of the task force recommendation, the interim task force recommendations. And what I'll be doing is, as we go down each item, I'll be asking each of the topic area leads or the chapter leads to identify any equity related issues that perhaps may need to be addressed that come to mind at this point, and also anything that might need additional analysis during the break as staff is looking over the task force recommendations in totality. So we'll be doing that and working through that. We also have Carla Bruce, who is Fairfax County's Chief Equity Officer. She'll be providing an introduction to that. And anyway, Jose, I'm afraid, is going to be pretty busy tonight, going from screen to screen and putting things on the screen. But hopefully, we'll be able to work through that tonight just fine. Then we do have a discussion on earned density, and then we'll talk about public engagement. And does anyone have any questions on the agenda for this evening? Okay, let's see how we are once we get through these items, and we'll see if we need to schedule another meeting possibly next week, or if we're ready to basically get the compilation finalized and get it off to county staff for their more in-depth review. Okay, any other topics, questions before we get started on the agenda tonight? Okay, well then at this point, what I would do is, Carla, I believe you are on. Let's see. Yep, there you are. Now, okay. You have Carla on? All right, great. Carla, we can't hear you. It looks like you're unmuted. Let's see. And Carla is the presenter, so we're getting there technically. Let's see. Jose, any suggestions?
It may be her audio settings. Maybe it's not just picking up her microphone.
Okay, Carla, we still can't hear you, but it looks like you're unmuted. And actually, I can see you, but can't hear you. All right. This may be a WebEx challenge. Let's see. So why don't we do this? Is there a way, Jose, is there another number that she can dial in?
Yeah, so she should have the mute button, then next to it's the start video button, and then next to the share button on the right, there's like a 3 dots that says more options. And she should be able to switch the audio, and she can either be called or dial in, and then change her audio settings that way. As a quick.
I didn't know you could do all that, Jose.
I just found out.
Okay, while Carla is looking at that, um, so Carla has some introductory slides that she'll be walking through here in a minute or so. Jose, perhaps, let's see.
Can you hear me now? I'm calling in through my phone.
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay,
All right,
very
there we
good.
go. We got it.
Good.
Okay.
Sorry about that. I have these problems sometimes when I try to log in through WebEx.
No problem. Thank you very much. And so, Carla, do you want to run the slides or do you want to have, okay, go ahead then.
Yeah,
And
I can share them.
there we go. Okay, take it away, Carla.
Very good. Thank you very much. I apologize for the technical difficulties. It's good to be with you all again this evening. As Supervisor Alcorn said, my name is Carla Bruce. I am the county's Chief Equity Officer, and I believe I've met with several of you. Maybe actually, as I looked at my last PowerPoint, it was exactly a year ago, February 8th, 2021 was the first time that I met with this group. But as you all prepare to look at how equity is a consideration in the plan, I wanted to, or was asked to just sort of come back in and sort of set a foundation for your discussion and hopefully answer some questions that you all might have as it relates to how equity can be a consideration. Before I jump specifically to talking about the Reston comp plan and the specific application or integration of equity into the plan, I wanted to just do a refresher on some key concepts that I had shared when I came to meet with you all originally. So if you can bear with me just to do that initial ground setting and then again make that shift to the specific application of an equity lens to the process that you all have been engaged in for the last several, as I understand, meetings. So just, again, to set that foundation and to remind the group that Fairfax County has made a commitment to advancing racial and social equity through our One Fairfax resolution and policy. And that's really a commitment to consider equity in all of our planning and decision-making and our delivery of programs and services. In doing that, it really applies to the work that of the Board of Supervisors, and this was jointly adopted with our school board, but also, you know, sort of all the operations underneath, extending to the work of the various boards, authorities, and commissions and community groups that the board appoints to work on behalf of the county. When we think about, you know, generally applying an equity focus, one of the things that we want to do is to set the frame that this is really how we're thinking about governing and managing the county. So at a high level, it's really based on a set of principles around understanding our history. So, you know, thinking about our current conditions, but really thinking about how our history has contributed to our current conditions. And not just thinking about where we are now, but where we aspire to be in the future, and recognizing that in many cases we see gaps between where we are now and where we'd like to be. Now, in order to get to where we'd like to be, it's going to require that we establish clear priorities and make some explicit choices. You know, setting a difference between where we are and what we're doing now to where we would like to be, which is going to require, in many cases, doing things differently and really adopting bold and innovative approaches and really, you know, being comfortable that we're going to have to change what we're doing if we're going to see different results. And, you know, again, this group is very reflective of this principle that in order to do that, this is not the work of the county government alone. It really requires the meaningful engagement of our community and other key stakeholders. I think it's important to think of the community engagement along a spectrum, and I'll talk a little bit about that in just a minute. So you all represent the community in many ways, right? So you all have committed your time over several meetings to provide input and guidance that really reflects sort of the vision and aspirations of the Reston community. But beyond the work that you all are doing, there's really, you can look around your virtual table and recognize that there are voices and perspectives that aren't represented. So beyond the work that you're doing here, community engagement also means, you know, more extensive community engagement outside of this process to make sure that there's an opportunity for the broader Reston community to provide input to the work that you all have done. So community engagement is not sort of a one-time thing. It really is this idea that it exists along a spectrum and that there are various roles for the community to play. So we'll talk a little bit again about that in just a moment, but I just wanted to reinforce that point that your involvement in this process is really a reflection of a commitment to equity and really wanting to center the voice of the community in determining the actions of the government. I also wanted to sort of give you the frame that we are following in terms of our understanding of how you integrate an equity focus. I think in many ways it's reflective of the process, especially that some of the subgroups engaged in around the topic of equity. So first is around normalizing the idea that, you know, Fairfax County and specifically Reston is a great place to live, learn, work, and play. We know that. But we normalize the acknowledgement that inequity exists, and there are definitely populations that are not sort of able to participate in the broader sort of success of Fairfax County, and many of those barriers are connected to, you know, structural or institutional inequities. We also normalize that when you look at who the people are that aren't able to sort of share in the prosperity of Fairfax County, it's predictable. And it's predictable by certain characteristics. But the two primary characteristics that we see when we sort of look across life indicators are race and income. And again, I'll talk a little bit more about that in just a minute, but again, normalizing that so that that becomes a part of our strategic planning and our strategic interest in this process, and frankly, in the governance and management of the county. We then sort of organize, you know, we bring ourselves together and utilize information and utilize different mechanisms and tools to begin to plan and better understand the problem, and also what are those things that'll help us in addressing those problems. And again, this process is really reflective of that beginning to normalize and organize, and then eventually, once these things get adopted into the plan and are really used in a sort of are tied to actions, that's when you begin to see the operationalizing of these considerations. So again, we're in this cyclical process. We're sort of constantly normalizing, organizing, and operationalizing it to achieve a vision. And again, the vision that we hold is One Fairfax. And again, that's racial and social equity and the ability for all people in our community to thrive and live to their fullest potential. As I mentioned, it goes beyond the work of government, though, right? And it's important that we engage the community and center the voice of the community. And we really think of this as an inside-outside strategy. So yes, a lot of this work is happening through the operations of our county and in the various county departments in the work that they do, but we really rely on the voice of the community to help us to understand how the doors of opportunity, again, our definitions around equity are really about access to opportunity or understanding barriers to opportunity, but how those doors of opportunity have been opened or closed to different populations or different areas of the county, and then what's driving that? What's at the roots? Why is that? Why are those doors opened or closed? And if we can get to the drivers in the roots of that, again, that'll lead us to the right solutions. And And again, there's the community's role to help us. And when I say the community, I'm talking about residents, but of course there are other stakeholders in the community who are really vested in Fairfax County as a place. And it's important that the work, that we think of this work not just as an exchange between the county government and its residents, but that we take into consideration the other sectors that are actors, so to speak, in creating the community of Fairfax County. And that we really have and hold a shared value around equity and understand that making choices to advance equity are really good for our whole community. You know, we have a tagline with One Fairfax that we all do better when we all do better. So often people understand equity as making choices for that benefit one group. But what we understand is that when you make those choices that benefit one group, they often have a multiplier effect, and they often have the effect of benefiting other groups and benefiting our whole community. So when we look at inequity in our country and inequity in Fairfax County and in Reston, we know that it exists across all sort of indicators of life success. Here's just a sampling of what those indicators of life success are. But again, as you've engaged in this comprehensive planning process, many of these outcomes are linked to the built environment. And so the work that you all are engaging is really getting at some of those root issues that are contributing to those barriers to opportunity. So again, our definition of equity is really important because what we're looking to achieve is this idea that we should no longer be able to predict advantage or disadvantage based on a person's characteristics. So if you think about, you know, race as a characteristic or a group identity, or income as a characteristic or group identity, we shouldn't be able to think about individuals based on those characteristics and be able to see where they will fare in terms of life success across these indicators. So our broader focus around equity is really centering race because, again, it's present across all these life indicators with a focus on improving outcomes for those populations and then closing those gaps between the racial groups. Again, the actions that we're taking, though, have the broader benefit of supporting our whole community. We also think about this not only, I'll say, at the individual level. Again, we're looking at making change in the structure of our community. Again, you know, there's terms that can be often used interchangeably. Equity and equality are terms that are often used interchangeably, but I think there's a really important distinction. We're not seeking sameness. We're not seeking to do the same thing for everyone. What we're looking to do is to understand how people are situated within our various structures in the community, our various systems within the community, and how we can make changes to that structure that would build people's access to opportunity. I believe I've shared this visual with you before, and I just bring it again to just reinforce the point that the differences really aren't in the people. You know, we know, generally speaking, that people want to, you know, live their fullest lives. They want to, you know, support themselves, support their family, contribute to their communities in meaningful ways. So if we can sort of share that as a community value, that that's what people are seeking to do, we want to think about how they're situated in order to be able to achieve those goals. And again, what we'll notice is that it's an uneven opportunity landscape that exists. And what we're looking to account for through our equity strategies is trying to balance that opportunity landscape. The principle we follow in trying to do that work is this idea of targeted universalism. So again, if you think about normalizing, we're normalizing the idea that structural inequity exists. we can generally say that structural inequity exists not by any action that we have taken necessarily as individuals at this table right now, but we're in a position that if we acknowledge that it exists and we shift our focus to building opportunity structures versus continuing to perpetuate these barriers to opportunity that exist, the idea is that we have big goals for our community. Again, we want the community to be a place where everyone can thrive and live to their fullest potential. We want everyone to be able to live, learn, work, and play to their fullest potential. But we recognize that because of structural inequity, because of barriers that exist in the community, that's not possible for everyone. So where those barriers exist, what can we do to be more targeted? We have universal goals. We want sort of the general goals for everyone, but because people are situated differently, we're going to have to apply targeted solutions. And again, as I think that this process is a real illustration of an opportunity to be more targeted in the application of our solution. As mentioned, this concept of opportunity over and over again, but just to contextualize it, opportunity are the same things all of us need to live and thrive to our fullest potential. It's access to quality education. It's a strong economy and the ability to participate in it. It's mobility and transportation. It's access to healthy food. It's access to green space and recreation and cultural opportunities. It's access to housing, it's access to healthcare, it's access to childcare. And one of the things it's access to that we really came to better understand in the pandemic is digital access, right? So with lacking digital access, children face barriers to the ability to learn. Lacking digital access, people face barriers to accessing information and connection to programs and services that would keep them safe and healthy, and also the ability to work. So again, what we're seeking in terms of the universal goals, these are the goals that we all share, but if we can acknowledge that different people have different levels of access, and I would also say not just different people, but different parts of the community. So that's when we get to the place, the significance of place, different parts of the community, and the people that live within those parts of the community have differing levels of access. So that's what we mean with this idea of targeted universalism. These are the things that we all want to be successful, but individuals and places are situated differently in relation to accessing these opportunities. And so in order, with that concept of opportunity, it also sort of, we have to think about the vulnerability, right? So people who are, or areas who lack opportunity have exposure in many cases to vulnerability. So it's important in this work that we understand what those vulnerabilities are and also understand where those opportunities exist and what the barriers are that are limiting people's access to those opportunities. Now, where we see that there are places where opportunity doesn't exist, then our goal becomes to build opportunity, So a very simple example is if we see that transportation options don't exist to a particular area, our goal might be to build transportation options to a particular area. In some cases, opportunities do exist, but there are barriers to accessing them. So, in that case, the opportunities there, we have to figure out what would help us to overcome the barrier. So utilizing the same example around transportation. So let's just say there is a bus system, but that bus system only operates on sort of the major roads of a community, and people who live deeper in the community don't have access to it. Well, what can be done to bridge that gap between the sort of the main road and people who might live, say, a mile or so away? So that's connecting to an existing opportunity. And then again, all of these opportunities fit together, whether that's education, or transportation or jobs, all of childcare, they all fit together, and they are all a part of the building of an inclusive economy that people are able to participate in. So we think of each individual opportunity as important, but realize that all of these opportunities fit together like puzzle pieces. And these puzzle pieces really can be best measured by people's ability to participate in an economy. Again, because people's ability to participate in the economy really represents people's ability to support themselves, support their family, and contribute to our community in meaningful ways. So those are the concepts, and I'm happy to, answer any questions about the general concepts behind our One Fairfax policy in our sort of strategies to support One Fairfax. What I also want to do is to sort of bring it down to an application level, right? So you all have been charged, as community members, to bring insight to the, sort of future of Reston and what that would look like. And so both now, sort of, around the groups that worked around sort of chapters, and then again, as you sort of take this work out into the community, what is it that you are sort of bringing to this that represents that equity lens? So here's a few questions that we as staff sort of put in place to think about equity as it relates to different policies, programs, and things that we are working on. But particularly for the community, what I wanted to point to, and I think I went a little too far, was the first one. Is like one of the things that you all are thinking, and again, I think Reston is such an important place for us to begin this work, because there was a vision. There is a vision for Reston, right? So there is the question of, is Reston producing the outcomes that the initial vision, how Reston was initially envisioned? Is there a gap there? And if so, what is it that we want now for Reston, right? How do we want to, or how do you all want to envision those outcomes you want to achieve for your community? What are you looking to change, perhaps? What are the community level conditions you're trying to impact for your community? Another area of input that I think is really significant, particularly around this type of community work, is, the type of data. Like, what are we looking at? What data is telling us our current situation? Are we looking at that data in a disaggregated way? Are we thinking about all of Reston, or are we looking at Reston by different groups? Again, remember I talked earlier about the significance of group identity. Are we looking at data by race? Are we looking at data by income? Are we looking at data by gender? Are we looking at data by ability, to give us a sense of how people are doing in relation to, again, our broader goal? There's the data we have, there's the data we might need. Again, we might have a certain set of data, but it doesn't answer all the questions that we would have. And so we seek additional data to get a more robust understanding of our current situation and what it tells us. And the other piece, which I've mentioned, is the significance of community engagement. And again, it's really sort of been embedded in this process from the beginning. You all represent one element of community engagement. It wasn't as if staff went away and had envisioned a plan for Reston. From the beginning, a group has been formed. But the question is that group representative of the broader Reston community, and how can the people who are going to be affected by the work of this group be more engaged? And are there opportunities to bring people in? And as I understand, that's going to be a part of your discussion later today. So again, we apply an equity lens in our work, but I think that those three areas, particularly for a community group, are significant. What I will offer to you as well as you prepare for your later discussion is to think about, sort of what do we mean by community engagement? And particularly in terms of community engagement as it relates to engagement with the county and engagement with the government, I really think it's important that we establish sort of the various roles, the role of the county as well as the role of the community. And we find that in the process of community engagement, we're really seeking different levels of engagement at different stages and at different times. Sometimes it's really just about listening. The county is looking to provide information. That information being informative, balanced, and objective information. And what we're seeking from the community is to understand, to listen, and to ask questions so that we can get an understanding and be assured that the community is fully grasping the significance of, whatever it is the county is seeking to share. In other cases, the relationship is more about contributing. Yes, the county is going to share information, but is also committing to listening to and acknowledging the concerns and aspirations that are expressed by the community. Ultimately, it might be a decision that rests with the county, but the role of the county is to accept information and to integrate that information received from the community into its decision-making. Collaboration is another element of this spectrum, right? There's more of a, not just the sort of listening and integrating, but really participating in the formulation of the solutions. The county is looking and seeking for the community to participate in the formulation of solutions. And then in some cases, and I think probably the best illustration of this is our Board of Supervisors itself, where the community is making decisions, right? So understanding what we're asking of the community and being very clear with the community about the level of engagement expected is critically important. I think it's hopefully been an important part of the process that you all have engaged in. It should be an important part of the process as you seek to broaden that engagement to a cross-sector of the community. But I offer this as a frame of reference to think about what it means when we talk about community engagement. And again, community engagement being such a critical element of incorporating an equity perspective. Another thing that I would offer is what are the things that we can do to make our engagement more inclusive? Language access is a consideration. Being, focused on plain language and utilizing concepts and terminology, and particularly when you're thinking about a comprehensive planning process that can be pretty complicated for the general public to understand, figuring out how do we deliver information so that it's meaningful to people. Thinking about place, thinking about the population and the sort of different characteristics of places and populations, and really bringing messages to the people instead of expecting the people to come to receive. And then in this age of, COVID, we've learned a lot about the significance of, facilitating engagement through virtual opportunities, but also realizing that many people's access to this virtual world is limited through some of their access to digital tools, as well as their literacy in utilizing digital tools. So again, offer these as just an example of some things you might think about as you open up the conversation about engaging a broader group of people in the work that you all have been doing. And then finally, sort of as you prepare to go through the work that you've been doing on each of the chapters, I wanted to, as I've talked to the supervisor and the staff, wanted to just offer this as a basic frame for how to integrate equity into the Reston Comprehensive Plan. So at the beginning, you know, it's an overarching equity statement and set of principles. And as I understand, you'll have an opportunity to reflect on what has been developed by members of the group. Again, your community engagement process will help you to validate that. That's the statement and principles that were developed by this group, but it can be further validated and potentially modified based on community engagement. We talked about the significance of data, and you know, hopefully your plan is, yes, based on ideas and aspirations, but also grounded in the reality of what's going on in your community. So looking at the data you have, like I said earlier, but realizing that some of the questions you may have, you may not have data available for, so seeking additional data to further ground your equity statement. And because of the process that you're engaged in, I mean, it's really important that the community have an unrestricted opportunity to share its interests and aspirations. But, you know, the comp plan is a process. You know, there are requirements associated with the comp plan. And so, as I understand it, the staff now will begin to engage more to bring what you've expressed as a vision to reality to be fully operationalized through the requirements of the comp plan. What I would also say is that, you know, you've been supported throughout by a number of departments, that when, you know, as I read through the sort of the statements and the aspirations that were expressed through the equity statements and principles, I realized it really touches on work that the county does beyond the Department of Planning and Development, beyond transportation, beyond the Park Authority. And there are probably lots of ways to operationalize what you all have described through your aspirations. And so while the comp plan may not be the vehicle in some cases for what you have described, there are other county vehicles. And I think that, you know, making sure that those linkages are made so that what has been expressed as an interest and an aspiration can find the proper vehicle, even if it's not the comp plan per se. And then for the chapters, and again, I think this is a really important part of what you all have engaged in, is that you thought about each one of those chapters and thought about sort of, if you think about those universal goals, right? And so now it's a matter of putting those universal goals in the context of the structural inequities that might exist. And so here you're identifying issues. Again, data is important here, and the community input is important in terms of identifying those issues. And then similar to the overarching work that was done, what principles do you want to support each of these chapters? And are there goals that you would set relevant to equity related to the specific chapters, whether that be transportation or public facilities or any of the other ones? Again, you have broader aspirational goals, but you spent time really digging into each of these chapters and perhaps have identified issues that are uniquely significant to that particular chapter. It's important to drill down the equity focus to that level where possible. So I apologize for talking so fast, but again, I think the significance of tonight is your ability to talk as a group. Really, again, just wanted to present you with a foundation to inform your discussion and to think about how all of this fits together in terms of integrating equity into the comp plan.
Carla, thank you very, very much. That was very thorough. I know some of those points were discussed. It's been a year ago.
Yes.
I know with the equity subgroup. Before we go to the next step in this, any questions or comments on Carla's presentation?
Put mine in the chat.
All right, thank you, Lynn.
You're welcome.
Hi got some thoughts maybe that would help.
Yes, John.
Number one, we have no data except the data that we created. We probably ought to go get that, but both the data that we have today and then what is it going to be in the future? That I guess that's harder to collect. But really what I want to talk about is our structure. And I don't know what other chapters or other comp plans have done, and I'm curious as what the experience has been, but it seems to me that our beginning probably is needs work. So the beginning would be the overall equity statement based on our community engagement process, which we haven't done yet. And then the targets perhaps would be in the way up front here. But then going through the chapters and inserting little bits and pieces, perhaps that's probably mostly there. I don't know, we can check that, but it seems what's lacking in Fairfax County's comp plans, and all of them, is an implementation chapter. Sort of how do you get there? If the upfront is sort of the goals and the targets and the equity statement, and then the chapters kind of bring it home the best they can at each chapter, but in the end, probably an implementation section that would really bring it home. How are we going to do what we're recommending in the chapters? That might be a good structure for us. Is there any experience with that or other comp plans in the county wrestling with this issue? No?
Yeah, actually, Barbara, I think you got a little bit of experience with comp plans. Do you want to address that in terms of implementation?
I always thought we were a little short of that in Fairfax in some of our plans, the implementation.
Barbara, are you there?
Yes, it took me a bit, but I'm here.
There you go. You're off mute.
Maybe it's something to think about rather than sort of unfurl a whole new organization.
I mean, so,
Yeah, Barbara, go ahead.
yeah, I think typically we do not put implementation in the comp plan. One of the reasons is, we want to, there are so many ways in which the plan can get implemented that we generally don't want to be prescriptive. I've seen some places where it's going, strange detail, like say, rezone it to a PDH district, which is just so restrictive that it doesn't seem very helpful. So I think, and I guess it also depends exactly what the goals are. There may be, once we figure out what the equity text is going to be, there may be some ways to put in strategies of some kind to achieve them. So I feel a little bit, like with this whole thing, we're on kind of new ground. And so it may be that once we develop exactly how the equity language works, there will be opportunities to add a little more about how we can achieve it.
Yeah,
I'm just right now without seeing it, it's hard to say.
Yeah. I'm just worried that we sort of march around the various chapters and we sort of put in our best thoughts and then, well, we all feel good about that, but it's not really reaching the equity targets that we want. So we might want to think a little bit about this. Anyway, that's just a thought.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, John. And I do want to recognize Michelle. I believe you are here, and I see your hand up, which is good because I was going to call on you anyway. Michelle actually did a lot of work with the equity subgroup, and I think sort of wrestled with some of these questions over some period of time. Do you want to go ahead, Michelle?
Thank you. Yes, and just to make sure we're clear, we had a great team working on this. Chris is on tonight, and he just posted in the chat. I think I saw Alvarez on tonight as well. I don't think Reston was able to join us, and Richard Cabellos is now the former director of Southgates, so that's unfortunate. But he was a tremendous help in our discussions. We did try to do what John just described in community health when we looked at access to healthcare. And that's also where we did look at data and we looked at metrics and we tried to figure out, well, what can we do when we're facing a situation where one of our providers has significantly high charges, and we have a community with multiple communities that have lower insured, or higher uninsured rates than other parts of the city. So this is something that we tried to do or start to do in community health. So I don't know if that can be a way forward. But one of the areas where we didn't have though is, we didn't have we were hoping to do a walkthrough and get a list of all of the parks that need improvements, sidewalks that need to be completed, and have that and have more data there. So there were other parts of community health that we did not get to tackle. But I wonder if there's not ways to at least do it where we're spotlighting some of the major issues too. So those were the things that I just wanted to share. But I did also just want to say, we had a really good team working on this, and so. But I really look forward to the next step on community engagement. Like Carlos said, it's so incredibly important, and so so thank you for the opportunity to work on this.
Yeah, thank you, Michelle. And by the way, when we do get to walking through the chapters and talking with each of the chapter leads, Jose will be bringing up the principles, the equity principles from the equity working group, and be an opportunity to kind of look from one to the other and see what might be missing, see if there might be some more analysis that needs to be done or data. So Michelle, thank you for that. I see several hands up. I'll just go from the top. Chris Daniel, go ahead, and then Gary Maupin's next.
Sure, thanks, Walter. I hope I can stay for the entirety of the meeting today. My wife is graciously managing our child and other child upstairs, so we'll see how that goes. Test run for the ARB meeting this Thursday, where I have to chair. Anyways, yeah, I can't echo Michelle's comments enough. The group that tried to put this together, plus the staff that helped us, it was really a Gordian knot to untangle here, because as John Carter pointed out, we just don't have this in the comp plan. And to be frank, the comp plan, the way Fairfax County does its comp plans is very by the book, very, very, I hate to say draconian, but it's very, utilitarian in format. And I think we have to push some boundaries here. And I think I've said it before, we don't want to let perfection be the enemy of the good in this situation. We want to try to get something that indicates that equity is a very important objective in this section of the comp plan. Now, maybe in the future, as I say in there, that does get absorbed into larger updates to the county comp plan overall. But I think we're not going to make any traction if we don't start taking first steps in some sections. So if we're the folks that are out here on the gate that can, make a definitive statement on setting some objectives and some benchmarks for what we really want to see development achieve, then let's do it. We can always improve, and the great thing is comp plans always get updated. I feel like that's, if there's one thing in life, it's life, death, taxes, and comp plan updates.
Thank you. I think that's good. Thank you, Chris. Gary, go ahead, and then Mark Malcolm.
I just want to thank Carla for doing this a year ago, because we had her input there as we went through, chapters and so forth, to make them the way we want from an equity perspective. And also, obviously, Michelle and the team, Chris and so forth, that just talked about this. I think that helped us do this as we went through each chapter to make sure we got equity really covered. So I want to thank the both of them for doing that and making our life better as we went through this process.
Thank you, Gary. Appreciate that. Now let's go to Mark Malcolm.
Thank you very much, Supervisor. To Carla, Bruce, I agree. The presentation last year and this year, they're extremely helpful. What is unclear is comprehensive plan gets updated periodically. is the One Fairfax policy undergoing any changes from its initial publication, November 21, 2017? Because my memory is it's linked to Chapter 11 of the county ordinance. There are about 4 or 5 policy memorandums that haven't changed on that, nor the Fairfax County Public Schools non-discrimination policy that are linked to this. But has there been, or is there a forward direction with the One Fairfax policy that we are unaware of that could be working with what Chris Daniels has spoken to, that lead toward what John Carter spoke to of implementation something? Because what's very unclear to me in everything that's been discussed, and what I'm trying to look forward in this, is the end goal is to improve outcomes from where we are now. Or the issue is, how do you measure you've improved outcomes? That's the something that you want as implementation to know that you're moving forward. That I haven't really seen, other than what we've had a couple of things with the housing specifically addressed. And there are other elements through each of the others, but we have moving forward, we don't know what is sufficient progress in a sufficient amount of time. And the reason for asking those questions is because that's how to justify budgets or reallocation of budgets, which is very much your business. And that's the thoughts I wanted to leave to the group. Thank you.
Mark, thank you very much. Carla, I don't know if you have any insight into any, I guess, recent evolution of the One Fairfax policy, or, you know, whether formal and or informally. You have anything on that?
Yeah, so what I can, and I appreciate that question. I think it's extremely important. One of the things I would point out is that when the policy was adopted back in 2017, the county did not have a strategic plan. What we have now is the county-wide strategic plan. So within the policy, sort of how we are currently measuring quote unquote outcomes is according to the 17 areas of focus and how we're doing in relation to those 17 areas of focus. What we now have is our county-wide strategic plan. And if you take the 17 areas of focus, they line up fairly well with the 10 areas of the county-wide strategic plan. Now, what I said earlier about how are we doing and then sort of figuring out where there are gaps, that's the process that we're engaging in now. So there's no, at this point, no intent to change the policy, but our plan is to align the policy to the county-wide strategic plan in the 10 priority areas of the strategic plan. And then as the metrics are looked at for the strategic plan in terms of how we're doing, that's where we expect to see those equity gaps, and that's where we would implement targeted strategies and make specific investments to close those gaps. We're not at that point yet in the strategic plan process, so that's sort of where there's, you know, this sort of lack of information about what the issues are, but that's how we're looking to make that connection.
Yeah, and Mark, I think this discussion also, I think we may have identified the first item to be looked at over the next 2 or 3 months in terms of implementation issues and particularly outcomes to be measured. As you mentioned, we do have some of that already in housing. Maybe there's some other sections I'm not thinking of right now where we have those laid out, but this is perhaps a good example where outcomes and implementation could be an area that staff can take a look at and come back perhaps with some suggestions for the task force appropriate to the comprehensive plan in 2 or 3 months whenever we come back after this break. So thank you all. Mark, does that make sense?
That makes perfect sense. The reason that I asked the question, very much we've discussed the public side of the One Fairfax policy. And the issue, as Carla had brought forward with beginning with the second slide, there are community and key stakeholders. And those stakeholders went across the education, business, nonprofit, faith, philanthropy, and civic organizations. But they aren't really how the county policies impact if the private side of Fairfax County is one of the things of looking at that. It's in the housing, it's somewhat in the transportation, a little bit with civic side of things. There are some things in the land use. It's walking it through. And it's, as Michelle Kimmel had brought forward, looking at the community health and the comment made toward health provision, especially a costly provider, that type of thing. How do you make it equitable? Those are the types of things that I was looking at. It may be too late right now, but it's a thought process that we still can address even as this goes through the staff and the public comment periods to get adjusted. That's the thoughts that I wanted to bring forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you very much. Are there any last questions or comments before we start going through the chapters? I see Charles has his hand up. Yes, go ahead.
Great. Thank you, Supervisor. And thank you, Carla, for the presentation today. And just thinking about the discussion we have teed up today, and probably one of the last remaining items that we have on the topic of density, I wonder if Carla has any observations in regards to the importance of us getting this right. I know it's something we've been discussing feverishly over the last few weeks. The impact of having the right amount of density as it relates to equity, making sure that whatever we do in this process, that we come up with ensuring that we've got the right number of units available to create the type of affordable housing that feeds our equity goals in this process. Wondering, Carla, what your thoughts might be on that.
Yeah, so I wish I had the answer, like if there were a magic number, so to speak. But what I will say is I think that this is one of those topics where there's often community tension. You know, setting a sort of a goal for what you want to achieve, but having interest in the community that might be on sort of different sides, so to speak, around that goal. So I don't have some sort of magic answer about how much it would be, although I do think that there are sort of some predictive analytics that can be tapped into. What I would say, though, is that there are the community engagement piece that you're going to engage, you know, these next phases are going to be really important in understanding sort of who you're hearing from, right? And again, understanding that tension that might exist across groups in terms of who you're hearing from, because I think that's the critical issue, is that, you know, where there might be voices to restrict density, you know, and those might be prevailing in some ways, are there voices that would encourage density? Because again, that would help to alleviate some of the challenges, at least as it relates around housing. And again, ensuring that there's a proper balance in who is being engaged, I'm hoping would help to get to the right balance in terms of sort of what that number is. So between that and, again, going back to the data point, utilizing to the degree it's available, those, you know, that predictive data that can give us a sense of what the future looks like.
Thank you, Carla. I see, Michelle, do you want to get the last word here? I think I see your hand up again.
Well, yes, my hand is up, but I'd actually like the second to last word, maybe. But I did want to acknowledge an omission on my part, an apology. Lynn was a tremendous member of our team, and I apologize for not have saying her name earlier. But I also wanted to hopefully give the mic over to her because she did bring up a point too about in the chat about the affordable housing dwelling unit ordinance and how it needs to be reviewed and amended. And I think this also goes to something that Carla, that you mentioned in the beginning. We had a vision for Reston, and it was of those communities of mixed incomes. And are we where we want to be? And I think there are a number of us who think that we did not achieve that in the TSA, and we did not get that, and that the amount of affordable housing and the income levels do not reflect the rest of Reston. And so it's a question of, you know, how do we also ensure that the housing that comes in is really affordable and is creating those mixed income communities that we want to see and that we have in the rest of Reston. So I think that that's something that's really important that has not been achieved. It just hasn't. Okay, Lynn, do you want to take it over from there?
Lynn?
Sure, I'd love to. So Carla, you were
Sure.
mentioning, if I may, Walter, I'm sorry, you didn't call on me.
No, I did. Go
You're,
ahead.
you're the chair. It's your
No,
job
no,
to
Lynn, go
call
right
on
ahead.
me. I just wanted to I don't want to say rebut, but Carla, you mentioned something about density and the challenges that are going on with density. And you are right, there are challenges that are going on with density, but we want to make sure that the density that is going in is appropriate for Reston and conforms with the planning principles and the design principles, and that the requirements for affordable and workforce housing are available. Because I can tell you, and you can look at the statistics for the density that has gone into the TSA, and that is all market rate dwelling units. So, you know, for the most part. So we are very concerned that, you know, new added density does provide equity to those who are in need. So thank you.
All right, Lynn, thank you very much. And thank you all, you, Lynn and Michelle and Alvarez and Reston and Chris who worked on that equity subgroup. There are some really, really good discussions, I think, in that. And Carla, thank you and your team for helping with those conversations. And I think challenging all of us to think about this in a deeper way, in a meaningful way. So thank you very much, Carla. Let's do jump in now, and I really have no idea how long this is going to take. So this is kind of me jumping off a cliff. But let's go, Jose. If you could go ahead and put up the agenda, and let's go, if you could, to the first chapter on the agenda, which I believe is planning principles. And I'm just going from memory on that one. And then what we want to do is both think about Carla's presentation, and especially, I think, slide 7 of Carla's presentation, which showed the elements of an opportunity neighborhood. There were, I believe, 8 or so boxes on that. And when Jose gets access, I think we'll see it on the screen. But the other thing that I would encourage folks to think about, there we go, is there we go, and this is in the equity draft from last fall. Actually, no, that was last summer. This is the planning principles, but also the equity principles that were discussed in the equity subgroup. So think about those. Are there things that maybe have not been included in the interim recommendations that should be? Are there areas that maybe need a little bit more thought? So again, the first one is planning principles. Thank you, Jose, for putting that up. And so, Jose, I don't know if you could go to either a split screen or I guess at least to put up the planning principles document. My guess is there may be a few of these things that are addressed on the fly, but other items might, if they're addressed or might need to be addressed in a later time. So, thank you. This is,
These were
yes.
these are two documents. Okay.
Okay, perfect. So on the left is, if folks can read it, key elements of a community of opportunity. And so I'll just read those. It's these are things that I think, as Carla said, we all aspire to: employment, education, mobility, food, recreation, culture, housing, justice, healthcare, digital access, and quality childcare. So I think as we go through here, think about these different elements and how they apply to the chapter, and how they frankly are applied or maybe not applied to different communities in Reston. So on the planning principles, John, do you want to, I know this was something you very early on took the bull by the horns and worked on this. Do you want to just spend a minute or two, I guess, reflecting on equity considerations in the planning principles?
I wonder if another place to start with it, I was interested in those 17 areas of focus that are in the Fairfax County. I wonder if we could, not now, but pull those up, see which ones apply to land use planning or planning, comp planning, and then measure them up against the principles. Or I wonder if we couldn't create a, what was it called? An equity statement based on our community engagement. I'm not sure I mean, we can go through these principles and they all have to do with equity in some way, but I'm not sure if you're looking at it from an equity lens that it really sings quite yet. I mean, I hate to get back into the principles, frankly, but I don't know if it works. Where's the housing one? We have housing for all, I believe. Yeah. So we stuck in the word equitable. I'm not sure we went. See, that's a nice statement, but I don't know. I mean, do you want to go through the principles one at a time quickly?
Well, I guess if just anything jumps out, and Lynn, I see your hand like
Yeah,
a real hand
I
up.
was just going to offer,
Certainly,
if we're
they
looking
all are gonna
for,
jump. Yeah.
yeah, if John, if we're looking for an equity statement, I think that Michelle has really captured it. And it's in the draft plan intro with equity, and it's
maybe
the
that's a good spot.
paragraph.
Mhm.
Yeah, it's on page 2 of 3, top, and it says, from its very founding, the Reston community has been committed to promoting racial and social equity and removing barriers that perpetuate injustice in our society. It's that paragraph, I think, really just encapsulates what we are, and it's from our formation. So I'd like to throw that out as something for us to consider.
Well, I think that's the right way. I think
Very
maybe
good.
that needs some more smithing, but that is upfront and kind of what I was thinking of.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's
You
in
want-
the intro now. The
Do
new
you want to look at the
intro.
principles just quickly and see? So.
Yeah, thank you, Michelle. And yeah, this is very helpful. I think we will be coming back to the intro. And I think Lynn, you nailed it. I think there's some really tight, good language right there. And John, yeah,
I'll
let's
put
just,
it in the chat. I'll just post it in the chat.
I'm not suggesting we're going to change it on the fly. I just want to relook at this and So
I have-
participation, well, if we mean it, yes, I guess that would be equitable. We're not very good so far. So far, we have a sort of a top-down approach. All of us wonderful folks are sitting around and figuring out what equity is when we've got a whole community out there that might have different ideas. So excellence, been planning, urban design, and architecture. Sort of equity, you'd have to stretch it. Planning will provide environmental sustainability. Well, I guess it's equity between those that have it, are sustainable, and ours that I'm not sure that quite fits. Development phase with infrastructure. Well, maybe. Reston will continue to offer a mix of urban and suburban lifestyles. Okay.
John, I was going to say, you're talking about urban design and everything.
Yeah.
And the urban design principle also touches on my favorite category of heritage resources. And I just want to do a plug for how much the equity group kind of wrangled with this issue, in the sense that making a chapter really isolated the concept and kind of what we were getting into today with the beginning presentation, which is that's why kind of Michelle came with this concept of interwoven, and we had these little snippets in each of the sections to help connect it, but also a presiding statement, which I think that's the only way to do it, is to recognize it up front that this is a strong concept that we're focusing on. But then when you look at sections like mine, like heritage, that's a really tricky one to try to you don't want to shoehorn in equity, but I'll tell you, sometimes it's a larger issue, because as my position as the chairman of the Architecture Review Board, we just did a cost share program to fund a study for African American heritage sites within the county, because that is one area in which we are deficient in identifying an aspect of culture in our community. And there are many other groups that also don't have as much recognition for their heritage in our county. I mean, we can all point to many sites in Fairfax County that are, those historic sites. I mean, I don't even need to name them. They're obvious ones. We've got a lot. But that's one area where it's really hard in a comp plan specific area to narrow it down, because one could say in the Reston section, well, yes, we will continue to focus efforts to identify, heritage sites for a diverse range of groups. But that's a county initiative. That's not really a comp plan initiative. So there's not much I can say there on that effort. But when you get to things like design or land use planning, I can say, well, yes, I want to make sure that when a person is enjoying Reston, they have access to cultural and heritage sites, which include heritage resources. So that means we need to plan, byways, access ways that need to be accessible resources, because if they're, captured, then no one can reach them, because enjoying and appreciating history and culture is one way in which a person, enriches their own life. So how do you capture that? Sometimes it's very much a minor emphasis in some of these places. And part of it, in my mind, as a person who sits on the board, is having it built into these sections empowers people like yourself and the supervisor and others who review applications to go, hey, I have a question now that I'm looking at, staff and I are looking at the comp plan. There's mentions of this concept here. Well, how is your proposal helping support that initiative? That's how I kind of felt, Michelle, Lynn, and all of us were being kind of sneaky as we weave it into here. It makes it a inevitable byproduct of any new planning action and development, is that's a concept you have to be able to think about. And hopefully that means staff is reflecting that. And I kind of wandered off path, so I apologize.
All right, good comments though, Chris. I do want to flag, Jose has put up on the left, these are basically the equity principles that the equity working group had pulled together on the different sections. So Michelle, I don't know if you want to just quickly sort of flag or talk about any of those as they related to planning principles.
Yeah, I think John brought up earlier the engagement, and so we included language that expanded on that. Now, obviously, our principles document, I don't know that we can include all of this language there. I think community engagement, since it's such an important part of Reston, might need a section in our comp plan that really lays out exactly what we want to see on the engagement front. I don't know that that would go in land use. I'm not sure where it would go. It made sense to go in equity when we were going to do an equity chapter, but now that we're weaving it, we've got to figure that out.
Again, something like that, I think that is an implementation chapter. That would be, rather than putting it in one of the chapters, it's so how are you going to do this section?
And so, and that would be one of them. Let's see, on the planning principles, the last planning principle, I think we need to expand on. That is getting or touching on the importance of equity, but where we don't really, what we haven't done in that one is really address who is burdened and who's benefiting from the results of the comp plan. And so I think the language might be too vague. The last one, number 12, it may be too vague. And so that would be one that we would want to strengthen and have a more firm statement there. I would like to say, looking specifically at just some language changes, there's one language change I would like to see in the bullet under health, the one that says preserving and augmenting existing medical facilities. I would like to just remove the 3 words, including Reston Hospital. And then I think there are some other areas too where we have to ask, there are a number of areas where we really have to look at that from the planning principles perspective. But I think that some of the language that that the small group did work on can help in that front if we do an implementation section, like John said.
I'm just I mean, the principles are what they are, but I think something before this, rather than, I'm concerned about, we're going to sort of weave this stuff in various areas, different principles, maybe some, maybe not a lot, but weaving it in seems like we're not treating it very well, equity, that we ought to have something punchy pretty much up front there. And then the planning principles reflect the presentation area of focus. So we're going to focus on equity. So what are the areas in Reston that we need to focus on? And then the principles would be a way of doing that. Rather than trying to weave it, we can weave it in the principles as well here and there, but I'm worried it's not punchy enough. It sort of gets lost quickly. And so we need something upfront, not too long, but something that's pretty punchy that would say something rather than a lot of platitudes and this and that. So something we would really accomplish. And I keep thinking of the 17 areas of focus. It's been a while since I've read that. There must be some of those that are particularly focused on our land use planning that we could put really up front. People would recognize what we're talking about. And then the principles implement that. And we can augment the principles however we want. But I just think spreading it around is maybe not strong enough.
Michelle, what do you think?
Perhaps maybe you can help me better understand. Does the intro go before the principles?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
So in the intro, we have done that. And
so you think it made a strong?
I mean, I think it can also, I think that there are ways that we can make it stand out more too. I mean, I've suggested one to have a call out box on interwoven equity that really makes it visually stand out.
Mm-hmm.
That this is something that's of great importance, but I think that's ultimately for the task force and the community to decide if we've done enough just by some of the added language in the intro.
Maybe
Yeah,
it's a graphic box, an actual box with a background to it that would really, okay, this is the equity goal that we have. And it would, rather than just weaving it in with all the other text, I just worry about that. And I think the introduction is a good place, whether it's a box or whatever it is. It maybe already have a good statement. Been a while since I've read it.
One thing that we did in community health is we did the interwoven equity, and we weren't formatting it exactly as we hope it'll be done, when it's professionally designed, but we did do it, so that it would stand out in the beginning. and have it labeled as interwoven equity, and so that it's not just, okay, now go hunt and find it, where is it in the chapter? So I think there are also ways that we can do it where it is still a part of every chapter, but perhaps very focused. Again, some of it's formatting, but pulling it out and having it, up top, which Chris did a great job of making sure that was I think the second paragraph.
Okay, I see Jennifer has her hand up. Jennifer? That may be an old hand. Oh, no, there she is.
No. I think that we're ignoring the fact that the equity group gave us basically an entire chapter with lots of specifics in it. The attempt to put it in the intro was an attempt to not have it as its own chapter. So I'd like to see the task force decide whether they think equity, with all of the specific recommendations they had, deserves its own chapter, or if we would like to go the direction of trying to implement it as part of the intro and also part of each of the subchapters. That's really, I think, the question before us. Because
So
I just, I appreciate Carla giving us another presentation, but I really think that this group, spent a lot of time working through it on our behalf. We are going to get feedback from many community members out there when we take this plan out to them. So I don't think that we're missing the community piece. We're only focusing on land planning within equity. There's a lot of other equity pieces that Carla and Fairfax, County will take, outside of the comp plan. We just need to decide whether we trust our subgroup, and if we think they did a good job, then we might consider approving it as a chapter.
Well, thank you, Jennifer. Michelle, are you okay with that? And I'm not sure if everyone else has read the chapter that way, but Michelle, what are your thoughts?
I think this is for the task force. I think this was a big discussion within our small group, whether it should be a chapter or interwoven throughout.
Yeah.
I see benefits to both. I really liked the idea of interweaving it, but that's just one person's opinion. And it might be that it might be better to have it as a standalone chapter. So I'm fully in support of either, as long as we address it fully and it's not just one statement and then, we don't see much from it.
Okay, thank you, Michelle. And I would point out that the equity draft, maybe we'll call it a chapter right now, but it was discussed quite a bit within the equity subgroup. There was a little bit of discussion, I believe, here at the full task force. So I don't know if folks have had a chance to really take a look at that, but anyone else have thoughts on should there be more of an interweaving of these equity ideas in the document, the equity document here, and maybe other equity related ideas as well, or should it be a standalone chapter? Does anybody else have thoughts on that? Chris Daniel, I see your hand up, and you're still with us.
Yes, I'm still with you. My wife is being amazing upstairs, giving a bath to a 4-year-old somehow and with an infant. So she's the real hero right here now, not me. So I was probably the principal one to spar with Michelle and our group about what we could do with this section, and then wanting to combine it into one. And I think the biggest thing I'd want to fight for, because I do think the intro that Michelle has kind of put together is fantastic as a standalone piece. But the principles that are on the other side, the left side of the screen, that were also crafted, they've gone through too and gotten a lot of input. And I would hate to see them lost too. I think part of what I started to embrace was that what we might have is a section within the intro or right next to the planning principles of, okay, so we're not a full land use or transportation section, but we're right up there at the get-go. And these sections are so cross-cutting that many of them can apply across the board. Because I mean, if you go look at the heritage resource one, that one's so chock-a-block all over the place. I feel like it could touch so many different sections, not just my little piece of the pie that I get involved in. So I, again, like Michelle, would put it up to the group, but I just don't want to lose this content that I think Lynn, myself, Reston, everyone who was there, Alvarez, it's all such quality material. I'm gonna forget other folks too, that we've had so many folks step into the group that's just valuable data that I wouldn't want to toss.
All right, thank you, Chris. And we have some new hands up. Let's go to David Vanell first, and then Jan Bradshaw.
Thank you, sir. I'm not clear why we can't do both. I think that it seems to me that the work that the folks put in to do the equity sections for each of the chapters and the introductory paragraphs and all that stuff, seems to me that what we ought to do is we ought to have the authors of that tighten up the sections, the intro and the sections, where everything in the chapter, every chapter is mentioned in some way in an equity chapter, if that makes sense, and then move the stuff that we don't want to lose into the individual chapters. So, for example, in housing, the stuff that was written, a page and a half or so, the stuff that was written is all good. Some of it is already in the housing section, but others of it are not. So I think equity deserves its own chapter. I think if it's scattered all over the comp plan and all the different chapters, it loses punch. And it loses a bit of, well, we can just kind of overlook that. We're not going to worry about that. You know, we're put it where it belongs in its own chapter.
Okay, thank you, David. We have Jan, and then John Mooney, and Tammy, and Bill. So Jan, go ahead.
Thank you very much. I'm sort of with David in that I think density is very important to concentrate on and to let people know that that is what we're trying to achieve. Then I think that the other ones, the introduction and the planning principles, could kind of show where that would play into those chapters. So I guess I'm a both person. I would like density to be emphasized as something that we are attaining. That's a goal that we want to attain for planning principles and all of the other sections, but that it is in its own right a very important goal for Fairfax County and for the comprehensive plan.
Yeah, Jan, I think you meant to say equity and not density, right?
That's right. I'm sorry.
Okay,
Equity.
all right. That's
Thanks for catching that. Absolutely.
no problem. I got it.
Okay.
Okay, and then we had John Mooney, Tammy, and Bill.
Thank you, Walter. This is a massive piece of work, this chapter. My only comment on it is I found it somewhat repetitive. And so perhaps some of the repetition could be called out. But so I leave it to the task force as a whole, whether we want the chapter or not, but it's obviously a massive piece of work. I am not for making it the primary place to discuss the transportation chapter, for example, for which I have had a special responsibility. I went through that chapter today, and there are 7 substantive sections where we address equity in some detail. And it is included in the transportation chapter as a metric. So we are saying this is a metric, just as TDM is a metric, so equity is a metric for the adequacy of the transportation principles and recommendations in that chapter. And so to me, it would strip something essential from the transportation chapter if you know, it were taken care of, if you will, in another chapter. Thanks.
John, thank you very much, John. Appreciate you making that point, and not sure tonight if we're going to have time to go through all the chapters. So, John, just as you flagged several of those key equity-related strategies in the transportation chapter that you championed, I'd encourage other chapter leads who maybe had a similar point to make that. So let's go. Next is Tammy, and then Bill, and then I believe Mark Malcolm also had his hand up again. Tammy, go ahead.
Thank you. I agree with David Vanell. I think that equity should be its own chapter. And I also agree that the document on the left that has very specific language and things that are pointed out in each chapter is also super valuable. I appreciate also what John Mooney has just said about how they structured their transportation chapter to be very sensitive to equity. So I'm in favor of, so much work has gone into equity. It is so important. It is one of the foundations of Reston. I'm in favor of having it be its own chapter, and whomever said there was duplication, 100% that has to be all, you know, removed. So it reads, so we're not reading the same concept over and over again. So that's my thought. Thank you.
Thank you, Tammy. Let's go to Bill. Bill, you want to say something totally different? That's okay.
Mainly, I think are we on our second or third or fourth last meeting? And I'm a little concerned that we'll still be here. You know, if every chapter now we go through it and we revive old issues. I mean, there was an equity chapter that we last saw, I believe, in September. So it's been 5 months since then. Any of the rest of us has looked at it because we were told it was supposed to be interwoven through all the other chapters. And I know that I think many people, if not all people, who did chapters did work on that to try and work things in. I think Michelle's opening paragraph, or what, a couple, 2-3 paragraphs that she suggested putting into the intro, I think those read great. I have, you know, no problem with that. I'm just worried that if we go back and now start back, we have to go back and reread the old equity chapter. And I don't know how many more meetings we're looking at. I was kind of hoping we were about done.
Yeah, me too. Yeah, in terms of, I think the idea tonight, and let's see where the task force wants to go, is this is an opportunity where there might be things missing in the interim recommendations of the task force in the different chapters for those to be flagged. And I think we've already heard one clearly in this, again, whether this is going to be a comprehensive plan element or maybe something outside the plan, but we've heard implementation clearly as one issue, and measuring outcomes. And John Mooney already noted, I think, some of the things in the transportation chapter have been already put in along those lines. But yeah, Bill, my hope is that, frankly, after tonight, there can at least be some direction, and then perhaps with some reformatting, whether it's both interwoven and included as a separate chapter, that ultimately can come back to the task force in 2 or 3 months as part of the larger set of staff recommendations. Bill, does that make sense?
That makes sense to me. But could I just ask one question?
Please.
There was the interwoven equity sampled paragraphs, which I read with interest, but my understanding is that wasn't to be its own separate chapter, but rather just ask the leads did you cover this or have other language that you did include? And I think, and that's fine. I don't think that's a lengthy discussion, but I could be wrong.
Yeah, Michelle, that was the intent. Is that correct?
I'm sorry, the interwoven equity, when this was sent around, we thought that the desire was to have it not as a standalone chapter. I think there is a way to do both. And I think that, I think it would still be beneficial to have an interwoven equity paragraph if we are going to do this. I think to address John Mooney's concerns, I think that, perhaps what we could do now is move this forward. And then as we go forward, do a cross check and make sure that the chapter leads know that this is the language that was not in your chapter, or and then have that addressed with the chapter leads perhaps. But I think there's a way to move forward with this tonight.
Okay, great. Thank you, Michelle. I see, Mark Malcolm, did you still have your hand up?
Yes, I do still have it. With respect to the idea of a separate equity chapter, I really think the idea of the equity, just as we have planning principles that started from the very beginning. Lynn Molston provided in the chat a very cogent paragraph that really is aligned with not the introduction, but planning principles for one Reston. The thing is, this is Reston's comprehensive plan that is subordinate to the one Fairfax and the county comprehensive plan. But putting it right up front, it belongs with the planning principles of establishing that equity is core to one Reston. And Lynn Molston wrote in the chat what was very key is a paragraph to bring the interwoven equity element to the rest of the chapters. I think that is a way to not have equity as a separate chapter that many in this community that we call Fairfax and even in Reston do not understand the one Fairfax policy and do not really understand equity versus equality. That even shows up in the Fairfax County Times as recently as the end of December, which I think you may be very much aware. Supervisor Alcorn, that's all that, just a suggestion as a path forward that's a little bit different from the rest of the discussion.
Okay, thank you very much, Mark. And I see, is that Mark Looney with a hand up? Is that right?
Imagine that, right? That
Wow.
I have something to say.
No, that you're great. Welcome.
So, all I was going to say is just listening to this, I have two observations. One, there's a lot of good thought that has gone into this, and in many respects, listening to Carla's presentation and then looking at the principles that are set forth here, it strikes me that a lot of these things are elements that are really applicable countywide, not just to Reston, and that there ought to be discussion for how these principles factor into all of the comprehensive plan or all of the county's policies as opposed to just Reston, right? I kind of think of it in the context of climate change discussions and whether one country that's leading the pack has to further limit its emissions when other countries who aren't doing as good a job aren't committed to the same objectives. And I do have some concerns about sort of how the implementation of this plays out relative to the rest of the county and to the rest of the region who might not be so forward thinking and applying some of these principles to what they're doing, number one. Number two, I'm a little worried from a procedural standpoint that we've spent the last 4 months voting on all of the various chapters with all of the various policy elements that go into that. and now coming back at the tail end and somewhat moving the goalposts in terms of the objectives that those chapters are supposed to meet without having the opportunity for a more full-throated conversation about the strategies necessary to implement these objectives. And so I would prefer that we do the 3-paragraph intro for now, and come back after we get the public comment, and to the extent that we need to seed in some of these elements into the various chapters, that provides a better forum to do so once we've had a more full-throated conversation about the strategies to be implemented, versus trying to shoehorn them in at the last minute. But thanks.
Okay, thank you, Mark. So Mark, you're suggesting do the 3-paragraph intro and then send the rest out for public feedback and engagement. And
yeah, I mean, just to point out an earlier conversation, Carla was very politic in her evasion of the question of how density affects the availability of housing. And to her credit, she adeptly sidestepped that conversation. But that gets to the heart of the conversation in many ways, and it gets to how you pay for and be able to afford some of the other elements that are in this document. And I don't know how we embrace making these elements a critical part of the land use conversation, or not just land use, but a critical part of all of these chapters, without having a discussion about how you implement them in the context of all of the other opportunities and limitations that are described in the other chapters of the plan. So unless and until we're coming back and having a conversation about how these principles get implemented in the context of all of the other objectives that are at play, I don't know how we endorse a more specific document at this point.
okay, thank you, Mark, and thank you for pointing out as well that some of these ideas and expectations are likely to become countywide. I do know that the DPD is working on a countywide policy plan amendment for equity. So that's, I believe, just getting going. That actually, for some of these ideas, could end up being the place where they ultimately reside. So thank you for flagging that. I do want to see, Michelle, I see your hand up, but I would encourage anybody. I think there's some really good ideas on process, good ideas on what to include, and where other things might go. But at this point, love to hear any motions on the table. Michelle, I don't know if you're ready to make a motion or if you had some other point.
Yeah, let's make a motion, because with all due respect, we've had this out since September. This is not something new. And I think that we're ready to move forward. And this gets at the core and the identity of Reston. So if the county wants to come on board at some later date, great. But right now we're talking about Reston and we're moving forward with Reston. That's my pep talk. So if we could, can we vote on including it in the intro, interwoven, and as a standalone section to highlight it, and we'll figure out the formatting, and we'll do a cross check to make sure that we haven't undercut any other efforts in the plan. But if we could just move forward with the language that has been presented, to the extent that anyone is concerned with the document that was sent around, that it was repetitive because the principles applied to multiple chapters. So the final version only had the principles listed once. So I don't think we'll have the repetitive nature. But we can also make sure that we address that. So that's what I would like to suggest. Would anyone
What's the
have any
motion?
other suggestions?
I don't understand, Michelle, what, are we
What's the
changing
motion?
chapters? What are we doing here?
So I think where we had the most consensus was that we do have it interwoven, right, in different chapters.
Right.
So what I would like to suggest is that we do have an interwoven equity paragraph. I motion that we vote on including it in the intro, and then having a section that lays out the principles of equity. And then also including interwoven equity paragraphs throughout the chapters.
I will second that motion.
Could I just ask what the interwoven paragraphs are? Those paragraphs that you sent around with the
Is
start
it
of each?
the three paragraphs on the left side or the right side?
So interwoven equity paragraphs in each chapter would just be pulling out the specific equity efforts and just highlighting them in paragraph form in the beginning of the chapter. This would just be going back and just looking at the work that was already done and also looking at the principles and adding any language from the equity principles.
So Michelle, you're not looking to have a separate equity chapter or explanation before the introduction?
No, I think the introduction would kick it off, but then it would be a section where all of the principles were lined up together. Isn't that what I think folks were leaning towards? If I've misunderstood, then, I think that's what makes the most sense. Yeah.
I wanted to, what I was thinking you were suggesting was, there's obviously the paragraph you were the set of paragraphs that we want to put in the intro that I think everyone's seen right here that Jose is showing. You're also talking about the interwoven equity, which I think we've talked about various chapters have within their individual sections. And some folks have talked about how that's like literally interwoven so much so that it may or may not be distilled into a singular paragraph. But then you also have the principles, which is on the other side of Jose's screen, which would themselves constitute some type of section or chapter, as you would call it, in here. And I think the challenge that I heard was the interwoven content that may not be as easy to separate out into each chapter as a, hey, here it is right here as a call out, but it's there. That being said, what I was going to suggest the motion might be is move forward with this draft text in the intro, keep the information in individual chapters that speak to equity, but make sure that each of the section leads cross-reference that with the principles that have yet to be formally finalized by the task force, but we want to move it forward for public input. Because this is such, as everyone said, and even with Mark's last comments, this is such a public thing that I think maybe taking those principles forward with us and saying, this is not yet, this needs some refinement still. The sections have been voted up, many of the sections have been voted on in the comp plan, but now we need to make sure that they match up. We heard a few comments just about transportation that perhaps maybe they need a little tweaking here or there, but that's kind of what I pictured the motion being was intro, the concept of it being incorporated throughout each of the individual sections, and then moving these principles forward with materials to go out to the public so that we get input on them. Is that accurate, or am I point?
Sorry, Chris, can we please have a differentiation between planning principles and equity principles? We're talking about principles, but let's be clear about what we're talking about. Are we talking about the equity principles on the
equity
left
principles? I think is what I'm
equity principles is what Chris was talking about.
Yes, that's what I was talking about. The equity principles.
Thank you.
Thank you, Tammy. And before we move on, I wanted to check, Michelle, do you have any thoughts on Chris's suggestion? Thank you, Chris, for making very specific suggestion there.
That's great. So if the only edit I would make to that is include the blue language in the intro, and then also the section on interwoven equity in the intro. So is that what you're thinking, Chris? Vote right now on that.
That would go along. Yes, that would go in.
That's what I thought too. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. And then we move forward with the document as written to the broader community to discuss the equity principles, and then we come back and we figure out how we can make sure that the equity principles were incorporated in the entire plan.
That and also staff feedback.
I still would like to see a paragraph or chapter emphasizing equity as being very important for Reston, and then going into the introduction and how it would be used.
I think that's what
Is
we're
what
saying.
that third item would be, Jan. That third
Yeah.
item is what you would be looking
Right.
for, that one on the left side of the screen.
Okay,
But
all right, that's good.
Could somebody
Bill?
maybe we can do it in parts, because I still don't think I understand what the motion is. The new language in the intro, the blue stuff, the interwoven equity, that if we have that as a standalone motion, I know what I'm voting for. If the part on the left side are things that many of us think we've already addressed in our chapters, and if we're saying, here's a checklist, we'll work it out over the next few weeks or month or whatever, to make sure that we've adequately covered, need to add a sentence or something, that's fine. But we'll do that separately. What we're approving tonight is this new language that Michelle put in. Is that what you're saying, Chris?
That's what I thought, yeah.
Okay.
So you're partially right there, Bill. So the blue language that in the intro with the interwoven equity stuff on the right side of the screen that Jose has up, I think that needs to go in and we vote on that as a package. The principles section that Jose has been having on the other side of the screen that relates to the individual sections, the equity principles, to clarify for Tammy, making sure I'm making that clear. Those principles, there is some potential redundancy and there is some potential inaccuracy with the individual sections that have been approved. That needs some refinement. But I think we do ourselves a great disservice if we don't move that forward and seek some input on that before we finalize that, because it is such a radically different section of materials that kind of gets to what Jan's talking about section speaks to equity, that if we sit here on it today and it doesn't move forward, then I think it just resurfaces later and we get accused of not really giving a public buy-in on it. These are principles that I think you are right, though, Bill. The individual section folks need to check against and go, hey, we addressed that in ours, or this is redundant, we need to strike this, or that's, so I'm kind of, I guess it's really two items being approved is what I'm saying. The right screen and the left screen. The left screen is, in my mind, an interim approval, not a full-on blessing, because there is still a lot of feedback. And because I respect, I think Mark in particular brought it up, there's a lot of work that could be done there still.
Well,
I don't know if that makes any more sense to anyone, or if I just made it worse. Probably made it worse. So
Can we, with that, I think I understand you, Chris. Can we just vote on those separately? I'd feel more comfortable that way as opposed to in a package.
That sounds great too.
So do the introduction first, the introduction and the interwoven. Okay.
yeah, the right side of the screen, left side of the screen. How's that work? Those two pieces Jose had up. Does that work,
All right.
Michelle?
Michelle, does that
Yeah,
work?
that works. But I think the one thing is when we're looking at the left side of the screen, that was reformatting the document that was sent around months ago so that each chapter lead could look and see which principles applied to their chapter. What we will be sending out to the community is, I think, a slightly edited version of the document that we distributed previously.
Which was never voted on.
No, it was never voted. I don't remember. I don't think we voted on it, but it was presented and we did discuss it.
So
Okay,
are we voting on that, Michelle? Is
so-
that what you're suggesting? I'm confused. I apologize.
2 votes. We're voting on the intro, and then we're going to vote on sending out the equity principles to the community.
Okay, sounds good.
Okay, Jose, if you could put the intro on the screen there.
I think it's the only Word doc. Are there two documents on the screen or just one?
Just
You
one.
had one. Now you're down. You're on one right now.
Okay, so this is the intro, everybody,
There we
with the blue text and then interwoven.
Okay,
I would like to make a motion that we approve what is this called?
Intro.
Can you scroll up, Jose? Sorry.
Intro.
Intro.
So that we can, so I would like to move that we approve the introduction to the Reston Comprehensive Plan with one amendment. I would like to suggest that we correct a typo on the Van Gogh Bridge, which is misspelled in the caption. But with that amendment, I would like to move that we accept this as amended.
Sorry for that
Okay.
typo, Lynn.
No worries. Not your fault, I'm
Seconded.
sure.
I second that.
Okay, it's been moved and seconded. Any discussion on this first part of two motions, or this first motion of two? Okay. Jose, do you want to go ahead and take a vote?
Yeah, let
I've
me.
got a question. I've got a
Yes,
question.
John.
I still don't quite get it. What happens to the equity principles and then the planning principles? Are those still in the introduction? I don't care. I'm just, what's the
We haven't
answer?
voted on those yet.
The planning principles have been approved and they're their own chapter.
Well,
Planning principles.
they're in
Not-
the introduction. That's where they are. The planning principles are in the introduction. I'm
No,
just
they're a
wondering-
separate chapter after this introduction and if
That's
this is
true.
approved,
Right.
this will be the introduction with equity. And then that's chapter
Planning
one.
principles. Yeah.
And then chapter two is planning principles.
Okay, where are the equity principles? That's what I was trying to get at.
We haven't
That
gotten
I
there
don't
yet.
know.
We haven't got there yet, John.
All right.
We haven't gotten there yet.
All right.
Supervisor, you want me to start counting some, counting the
Yes, and this
hands?
is just the vote on the introduction, right?
Yes, this is just, the motion was for the introduction to this text in blue, plus the interwoven equity paragraph that I'm highlighting right here below. And
Okay.
the minor
Amendment.
amendment to change the
To
spelling. of
correct the
bridge.
typo of the Van Gogh Bridge.
Sorry about that. Okay, so I'll start counting hands. All those in favor, please raise your virtual hand and I'll start counting in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
And this is for interim approval.
This is for interim approval. So I'll start counting. Guess I counted 19, but let me count one last time.
Sure would have liked to have had this for land use.
We don't have a jobs housing balance, by the way. We're out of balance.
I count 19 hands. Am I missing anybody? Okay, Supervisor, so those are 19-4. Everyone clear hands. Moira, I think that's a previous hand. Okay, so all those not in favor of the motion, I'll start counting hands in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Okay, so I see one hand. Any other hands? Okay, everyone clear hands. And then we'll do abstentions in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Okay, so I see two hands, Supervisor. So that motion carries. So 19-4, 1 not in favor, and 2 abstentions.
All right, so that's motion number one. Motion number two, who wants to make that for Chris or Michelle, maybe?
I'm happy to take a stab at it, Supervisor, if you'd like. I
All right.
move that the task force provide an interim approval to the equity principles with the intention that they are brought forward for public comment, following the understanding that they will be reviewed and refined further following that comment.
Okay, that's the
I'm
motion.
trying to for context, I'm trying to recognize the fact that many folks would still like more time to weigh in on these, but I think the public review is important.
I second.
So, okay, that's been seconded. Any discussion?
So
Yes,
where does that
Supervisor,
come-
this is
Yeah.
Mike Jennings.
Yeah, hi, Mike.
Hi. I don't know how we could approve this even interim, since most of us received this months ago and didn't read it or look at it with the notion that it would be approved in this format, because we thought, oh, this is for the chapter leads to weave into their document. And we assumed that that took place. And I think giving it even interim approval lets the public think that we're okay, that we've looked through this language and that we're okay with it. And I mean, I frankly haven't done that because of what I just said. I assume the chapter leads had that responsibility to weave it in. So I do not think it's right to be voting on this to move it forward.
Okay, thank you, Mike. Other thoughts? Other discussion?
This is Tammy. I
Tammy.
am a chapter lead, and I went through my chapter, and I have a couple of deficits, which I will work with Bill Penniman to correct. Art is great. We didn't have any, we had everything covered there. We have one issue in environment. So, you know, it is up to the chapter leads to rectify this. So I don't see what the issue is. You're not a chapter lead, Mike. So, you know, John Mooney's already talked about how he's made equity a forerunner and an emphasis in his chapter. Chapter leads have taken the responsibility. I don't think there's anybody here who hasn't done that, who's a chapter lead.
Okay, then we don't need to approve this if it's all been woven in.
Well, we need to be sure, as I said, I have one deficit in environment. We did not mention environmental justice. And I'll have to talk to and find out what that actually means and talk to Bill Penniman and see what he thinks. But this is an interim. It is not a final draft. That's what we're voting on.
So, Supervisor, if I may, a question about process. As the chapter leads review their chapters against the backdrop of these recommendations, which Gary and I actually spent some time working on the economic development piece earlier today, to the extent that there may be some languaging or items within this that we feel is more adequately addressed or is better addressed in the version that was approved, how do we reconcile that if we're voting that this document is going to be released to the public for feedback, if there is some discrepancy between the chapter leads and the text that's being presented here?
Good question, Charles. I'm going to ask the maker of the motion.
And just that's not an intent or anything. It's just, it's covering all that, just to maybe covering it, you know, with some different words to get to the same point. That's all we're talking about there.
Sure, and the discrepancies could be as simple as some wordsmithing, but there could be some more substantive disagreements, or at least to the point where they feel that the text in here changes their chapter substantially enough where it's now different from what this group had voted for whenever it was originally approved.
As the motion maker, I hope that that's part of the discussion that will come out of that. And in my mind, if a voted on section that moved forward does have discrepancies, they can either, as Tammy pointed out, be aligned with that principle, or this principle is going to have to be changed, thus indicating the interim approval to it. At least that's the way I interpreted it. I wanted to be transparent that this has only gotten a partial blessing, not a full blessing.
Sure.
This is
So
also
then,
for greater community engagement. And so, yes, there are those of us who are chapter leads, but it's ultimately got to go to the community. And so something you have in there working on a chapter may change when it goes into the community. And additionally, you know, I think that just as, you know, that's moving forward, equity can move forward, and then afterwards we can rectify any differences and discuss it then.
so to the extent that differences will be rectified. If there's a discrepancy, are we saying that this document wins out in that conversation? Is there an opportunity for the chapter leads to make changes to this before this goes to the public? Is the motion allowing that to be a provision of the process?
This is going to the public. You're part of the public. If you want to weigh in too, I mean, I think there are going to be meetings that will be specifically on equity. And so that should be part of the discussion.
Michelle, this
could I
is
have-
Chris. I would be also completely happy with the motion carrying the fact that section leads will be coordinating with this to address potential discrepancies as well as items for future discussion following public comment too. I envision that happening a few months down the line when we get more feedback on this too.
Okay, we do have several hands up. Bill, I see your hand physically, so I'm going to cheat and go to you. But then I see Shane, David Gill, David Vanell, and I think Mike still has his hand up. But Bill, go ahead.
I guess one question is, there are some things in here I'm really not sure at all how they would work. I mean, I understand all public facilities will provide free broadband access. That's the county. The county can do that. But I'm not sure how all development provides free broadband access. I mean, if you buy in a condo, who gave it to you for free? If you are renting, aren't you really paying for it no matter what? Or are we offering it to everybody who comes? I mean, there are just some things that I don't think have been discussed through beyond that.
And Bill, this is Mark, just to put a finer point on that, on page 3, there's a statement under the community resilience that talks about development will include varied land use that protects and enhances existing neighborhoods and green spaces. And in theory, that sounds great. In reality, we've got 80 years worth of history that says that exclusionary zoning or exclusionary development that segregates one neighborhood from another and one housing type from another contributes to the inequity as opposed to helping to solve it. And that was my point about sort of the strategies for how you go about addressing these equity objectives could be substantially different than what we have in the draft. And so that's my discomfort, I guess, in putting this forward, is that there's internal inconsistencies, not just in the language, but in the strategies that we're suggesting in the various chapters to address these goals. Said another way, I'm not certain I agree necessarily that protecting existing neighborhoods is really the policy that ought to loom large over this whole discussion.
Okay, Shane, and then David Gill and David Vanell, and then Mike.
I guess it's just Shane. I want to express some confusion because the first time I saw this actual draft was on Friday. We've been at this for years, literally, and I'm not a chapter lead. Mike's not a chapter lead. We'll accept our fate, but the reality is this is the first time we're seeing this. We've had 3 days to look at it, and there's some very good things in here. There's some things that might not be as good, but what's the problem with allowing us some time to look at it as a task force before we provide our quote interim recommendations?
Okay, thank you, Shane. David Gill first. David?
See my time. Sorry.
David, we can't. Looks like you're unmuted, but we can't hear you.
Yeah, no, go ahead. Mark already addressed most of what I was going to bring up. So go ahead and move to the next one. Apologies.
Okay. David Vanell, then Mike Jennings again.
Thanks, Walter. Although I don't have any particular issues with what is in affordable housing. I might have, things were worded differently than I might have worded them. And there's one or two issues that I think bear inclusion in the affordable housing text. There's a good bit of issues with kind of some of the other sections. I just don't think that this is ready for prime time. I agree that with the previous speaker that this needs to be looked at more carefully before it's given to the public.
Okay, thank you, David. Let's go to Mike.
Well, that was a hand I didn't put down, Supervisor.
An old hand, no problem.
Old hand.
All right. David Gill, I believe, are you, let's see how your audio is now. Is it better?
Supervisor, just go ahead. I was just going to echo what Mark.
Okay.
So.
Okay. All right. Fair enough. Let's see. Charles Kapoor, is that your hand up?
It is. And just to kind of follow up on some of the questions, confusions I had, and following up on David's comments, it strikes me that every step along the way, and I recall it being said earlier that the idea is that, this is for the public to view, and certainly we're part of the public, but in every step of the way before this, we as a task force have sort of come to some level of consensus, a majority vote at a minimum, before this moves off our plate to the next step, which ostensibly is public debate. And so to the extent that, again, if there's going to be some discrepancies between language that's here and the chapter leads, I think it behooves us to resolve those here as a task force before we go to the public. I think there ought to be consensus, especially amongst those who have spent the most time focusing on a particular chapter, before text is released to the public, which will presume that those that were responsible for authoring it agree to it, especially if the strategy is that as we take this around to the public, task force members are going to be charged with the responsibility of presenting their areas to the public. And if they have to present information that they don't quite believe in, that can cause a lot of confusion for the public to which they're presenting.
Okay, thank you, Charles. Chris, Daniel, is that your hand up?
Yes. So I think one thing I'd like to highlight is that it seems like we're taking things to the public, and it sounds like if we don't start taking this to the public, it'll get killed later by saying it didn't go to the public. So I do think we're getting ourselves into a kind of a catch-22 scenario here. I recognize, and I think Michelle's recognizing, that there are discrepancies, but I think we want to seek that public input. And I think the presentation at the beginning, if anything, encapsulates the fact that we need to seek that. So I don't intend to withdraw my motion. I think we should have a vote on it.
Okay. All right. Thank you, Chris. Any other comments?
Maybe I'm the only one who doesn't quite understand this. What is the task? Where do these principles go? Is this a standalone document outside the plan? Is this now part of the introduction and the principles?
It would be their own unit, John, would be the idea.
So this would be up front or someplace so this would go
This would
as
have a
is.
little section all to itself called equity of some type.
Okay, because we got confused. We started talking about a section, then we started talking about the chapters. So I didn't quite get it.
Sorry,
So
I interblurred section and chapter.
you're
That's
voting
my
on
fault.
this being in its own section, probably in the introduction up front somewhere, right? Is that what the vote is?
Or is it separate, Chris? I didn't understand what you just said. Are we?
This text will manifest itself in some format, either as a chapter in and of itself or an additional section onto the intro. We have indicated in this vote that it is still very interim, but I think one of the key goals Michelle and I were pushing for is we need input on some of this content. I we don't have a recorder, I believe, in this group. We do have a video, so we'll have to go back and watch my exact language. But I'll caveat, and this is maybe a chairman of another board, we don't have bylaws, so that isn't helping us either there when it comes to voting on things. So
I think it's clear.
So our goal is to vote on this as an interim status, not a definite permanent draft. Is that correct? And then in the next week, the chapter leads will get together and clarify, yes, we understand, and this is the addition to our chapter, and we'll discuss that next time. Is that what we're doing?
No,
Is that the process?
that is not the process. This will be voted on and then go to the community for community input and to make sure that the equity principles reflect the community.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, Gary, I believe, has a hand up. Gary, did you want to?
Well, I think that was down, but I'll just comment that on economic development, worked our heads off to make sure the equity is in there. This is extremely important, and what Michelle and the team, Chris and so forth, have done is critical, as we've talked about many times tonight. It does give me some pause, though, because the wording will be different. Even though we had this document and obviously the presentation and one Fairfax sitting next to us all along and doing this, there's going to be some, wording differences, things here and there that are different, and it's going to give some appearance that, one chapter has this and one chapter has that. That's my concern. Not that this isn't what our direction should be. It's just, kind of how it's going to turn out in the end, and could be confusing, as Charles or somebody said.
Okay, all right, Gary. Any last comments?
Mark Malcolm, before we vote
Yes.
on whatever we're voting on, please restate what we're voting to, because even in the last few moments of having the discussion, the introduction, or a section immediately following the introduction will have the equity principles preceding the planning principles and the rest of the document. If that's what we're voting to, that's what I initially understood, and it got muddled in the last few moments. Can we clarify what we're
Mark, I'm
voting
happy
on?
to.
Yep.
What you
Go ahead,
literally
Chris.
just described is what I was proposing, but not going to stipulate directly where it goes, because I didn't want to go that far. So that's right now. There are equity principles that have been submitted previously, have been talked about, have gone through some discussion, and some of them have been interwoven into the various chapters of the comp plan. Lord help me, I got that one right, I think. And what we are asking is to take these principles forward, the equity principles, when we go out for public comment, recognizing that there is still work and refinement to be done on them, and seeking that input on those principles. So
Yeah, Chris,
my understanding is that we will still reconvene, and we could vote this as an individual chapter, or we could say, no, these principles should just become a section in the intro. But I didn't want to force that location, because I think there's still quite a bit of heartburn. And so we're more focused on the input on the content.
So, Chris, let me just add one thing to what you said. In terms of the public outreach, we're really talking about initial public outreach in the next 2 to 3 months. Going to some, we've talked about Reston Association, the Reston Chamber, and perhaps some others, but there'll be a much more robust public outreach and public engagement after the task force reconvenes and finalizes recommendations. And that's going to be later on in the spring. So I just wanted to make sure everyone was clear on that. This initial public outreach is designed not only to help socialize some of these ideas that are in the interim task force recommendations, but frankly, to get the task force feedback that can then be utilized perhaps in the final task force recommendations.
So Walter, then perhaps I commit the equity folks in the sense of saying that one of the things that would happen after this interim approval is that we would have coordinated communication with those chapters on these principles. So we could then kind of bridge that gap that's being discussed between them in the interim too. We'll have the time to do that so that we have a set of principles that comes back to the group that has been liaisoned between them a bit more. Some of them, it might be really easy. But for some of the other ones, it sounds like there may be some more, viable discussion. And since we've had interim approvals on several chapters, that's going to give a lot of precedent to what may or may not stay at a principle, equity principle, that is. I'm happy to commit to doing that as one of the equity folks and working with Michelle to do that.
I think
Michelle?
that's important. I think what we're trying to gain here is that we communicate and we better engage with the communities this most directly impacts. And so it's setting up in very quickly and soon outreach with those communities who are not necessarily represented by Reston Association or the Chamber. And so we want to make sure that other voices who do not have people on these calls every time are heard. And, we had a group working on this together, but we also recognized that it was a small group and it did not necessarily get all the voices. It simply did not. And so this is about going to the community groups who are most impacted by this. And so that's what we need to do. And that's what we're trying to move this forward, to hear from them and to better engage there.
Okay, thank you, Michelle. Any final comments before we call a vote or questions?
I just would urge people to figure out where this goes, not to go out to the community. Well, it could be here, it could be there. Tie it down and put it together. And some, otherwise people are not going to know where to read. I don't think the group knows exactly where to put. So put it someplace. And I don't know whether you want to go over these principles, not tonight, but whether sounds like there's some issues with the principles. I don't know how the vote's going to go. Maybe you should just go ahead and vote, but sounds like there's some wordsmithing here. But anyway, enough of me. I would urge us to be concrete, figure out where it goes and put it in there.
That's why I spoke earlier, Mark Malcolm, once more. We've had a discussion. I think in terms of journalism. Tell me what you're going to tell me, because in the body where it's interwoven, you're telling me where you told me. The discussion, John, you brought forward about implementation is tell me what you told is the third portion. But I think in journalism, you got to have it up front, and it's either the introduction or it immediately precedes planning principles, no matter what, because of the equity principles are driving or are integrated, as Lynn Molston had provided much earlier in the chat. They're integral with the planning principles, but we have said that they are distinct and separate. So if they're distinct and separate, they precede the planning principles.
For what it's worth, I think you're right on track. It gives a specific place. That's where it goes. I like that.
All right. Any final comments before the vote?
Walter, this is David Pinnell.
Yes, David.
I think the description, the differences in the description between what you said were going to be the initial public outreach contacts and what Michelle described is indicative of the fact that this just isn't ready for public use yet, and we need to have chapter leads need to, and the task force needs to look at this document and pare this down so that it makes sense, and make sure that the principles that they're talking about that were written in here for transportation and affordable housing, public facilities, etc., match what's already in the in the document and had been voted on. This is, I mean, we've just sort of stepped outside the bounds of how this task force operates, and I'm not quite sure why.
Okay.
Because this affects a group that is not represented well in this task force. That's why. And we need further input, and that shouldn't be crazy.
All right, let's go to a vote. Jose, do you want to take the roll, please? Or, sorry, take the vote, not the roll.
What is the question?
All right, so Chris, go ahead and restate the motion, and then we'll vote.
So we are voting to move forward with an interim approval. The language you see here, Jan, that discuss various principles regarding equity. Location specific in the comp plan to be determined, though likely for following the intro text and the planning principles, though yet to be decided. This language will be liaisoned with the various section heads and is going to be brought forward with the initial public efforts that are kicking off so that it can be full, we can receive more feedback on it.
Thank you.
Okay.
Oh,
all
okay,
right.
sure. That I'm glad I captured it.
Okay, so let's go to a vote. Jose?
Okay, so everyone heard the motion. All those in favor of
Who
it?
was the second?
Oh, wait, was
Just-
there? Oh, sorry, Lynn.
Who was the second?
I second it. There we go.
Michelle seconded.
Michelle. Okay, thank you.
So you all heard the motion and Michelle just seconded. So I'll start counting hands. All those in favor, put your virtual hand up and I'll start counting in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. And everyone keep those virtual hands up. So let me just count this again. I counted 11 hands, but can never be too sure. So that's 11-4. Okay, everyone clear hands. Alvarez, your virtual hand is still up. Okay, it's gone. So all those not in favor of the motion, please put up your virtual hand and I'll start counting in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Counted 7. I'm just going to double check. 7 hands. All right, everyone clear hands. I'll start counting abstentions. Okay, so all those abstaining, I'll start counting hands in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. See 3 hands. So supervisor, that's 11-4, 7 not against, and 3 abstentions.
Okay, all right. Divided, but yet a majority, maybe a slim majority, but yet a majority, did want to move forward with that. So thank you. I want to thank Carla for hanging in there with all this and for, I think, framing up the discussion and getting that started. Thank you. And I do want to point out too that it was discussed in terms of who the outreach is going to go to. Some of that is still TBD. But before we dive into the last piece of the meeting tonight, which is going to be talking about that public outreach and engagement, I did want to spend a little bit of time on the earned density idea and get feedback from you. I know there's been some good discussion via email during the past few weeks on that topic. Also, and if everybody could just hang with me for a little while longer, I promise we'll try to get everything wrapped up by 10 o'clock. But if you could, Jose, if you could put up the questions that were asked. Jose, how many folks responded to this set of questions, at least via email?
I know at least Jan had sent some responses. I'm not
Jan,
sure.
you get the gold star. Thank you for sending around, getting the discussion started anyway.
I thought it was going to be a discussion.
Yeah, all right, that's fine, Lynn. Yeah, there's no deducting. No deducting points. But the discussion, and let me just very quickly point out what we're looking here is to get some overall direction on some of the high level issues relating to earned density. And the first one that came to my mind anyway is, should earned density be used to bring down the comp plan density range or not? And then, so the other thing, and hasn't been much discussion this tonight in the equity area, but are there items that have been discussed during your deliberations that go above and beyond task force recommendations? So basically, are there things that were not included for one reason or another in the interim recommendations that might be earned density criteria? And then the flip side of that, number 3, are there things that should be off limits? If there are some sort of earned density criteria that are established, are there things that really should not be factors or criteria in that system? And then the last one on here, another just big picture question, where should earned density criteria kick in? I know one of the ideas that was floated earlier by John Carter was at the low end of the density range, if there is a density range for that area in the comp plan, or if there's not a density range, 50% of the maximum density. So those are some ideas, or maybe it's another level that it kicks in. So anyway, these are some of the questions, and I'll just open it up and see if there are thoughts, if anyone still has any energy left. I know we just went through a lot with the equity discussions. I do see hands. All right. Let's go with Bill and then John Mooney. Oh, Bill took his hand down, so John, you're on. John took his hand down too, no? Either Bill or John.
Walter, I will say something.
Okay, John, go ahead.
As to the first question, should earned density be used to bring down comp plan density ranges? And that is a fundamental and a sensitive issue. And going back to statements that I made based on my research, which I still believe to be true, something happened between 2014, when phase 1 was first approved, and 2015, when during the uniting of phase 1 and phase 2, the densities allowed in the TSAs increased 31% overall and 58% for residential. And I'm concerned personally, speaking personally, but I know that many in Reston Association believe this, but at this point I'm speaking for myself. Very concerned that we don't know what effect that will have on the overall One Reston community. when our colleagues from the Fairfax County Department of Planning and Development addressed us about Reston population scenarios. It ranged, as we all know, as high as 127,000, 128,000 if the maximum non-residential scenario allowed by the current plan happened, or if the maximum residential, it could lead to a population of 158,000. So so those are still questions and concerns for me personally, and I know for many. And if that is true, then I am open to a reasonable use of earned density to control the higher ranges of those projections. Thank you.
All right, thank you, John. I see more hands up. Bill, let's try again. Are you?
Okay. In the last meeting approved the land use chapter, and the designers of the land use chapter said it did not that it kept the same ranges and did not involve down planning. The earned density section as written would effectively implement down planning. And I think it would end up, it imposes some burdens that are impossible to meet, and it's just not realistic, and will end up harming TOD development. I care less about the TSA areas outside the TOD, but in the TOD, you really want the development to occur. I think there are a number of incentives we should be recognizing. I suspect a lot of the musts are going to be rewritten by the staff to be shoulds. So moving up from the low end of the range by taking a should and actually implementing it would be sensible. Things that used to be bonus density materials should be restored as bonus densities. To the extent somebody may not want to build the ADUs and WDUs, but maybe it donates some land or provides funds for the county to acquire land that can be developed as more dense WDUs or ADUs that goes beyond. That would be fine. Those are the sorts of things that people should be encouraged to do. Having things that implement CCAP better, zero carbon development, that sort of thing, all should be grounds for development. The greater density will bring with it more WDUs and ADUs, and it'll also lead to more successful transit-oriented development, and people will come there because they want to. So I would not weaken or lower the bar. I wouldn't burden rising above the minimum to the point that we're effectively down planning. And I share some of John's concerns, but I never understood where those numbers came from, either the 44,000 that got stuck in 2017 or the projections of how it could go so high, because they were never part of forecasts previously or in the land use chapter. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Bill. I see Lynn and then Shane Murphy. Lynn, go ahead.
Thank you, Walter. I was going to stay out of this conversation tonight, but I do have to make it very clear to the folks on the task force in terms of, and this is my personal viewpoint on the first question, should earned density be used to bring down comp plan density ranges? The answer to that is no. Earned density is a methodology for builders and developers to earn their way up to the higher densities that are in the ranges. And, you know, if there's a 13 to 20 for the medium, we never see folks coming in at 13. Everybody comes in at 20. So we just, this is a methodology to bring some common sense to the process and a return to the community for those higher densities. So that's all I have to say about that. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Lynn. And Shane, you're next.
Yes, sir. And I think the question I was going to ask initially was bring down the comp plan density ranges from where? And I just heard Lynn talk about no, but potentially yes. And so and potentially yes in the sense that you're not going to get to the higher end of the density ranges unless you do earn density. And I would associate myself with the comments from Mr. Penn earlier. So I think it was Mr. Penniman that essentially said these can be two separate concepts. You know, the concept of bonus density, which is primarily for ADUs and WDUs, which are important to Reston, and the concept of earned density, which I think is a different concept, which is, you know, what kinds of facilities does Reston need? How do they need them, and what's the density going to be for them? And I've got to say, if we're going to sit there and say, hey, the higher end of the 2014 plan is reserved for those who do these extra things, I don't think the plan's going to succeed. But I guess I would go back to my first question, which is, you know, I don't understand the question, which is where are we starting from in terms of the comp plan density ranges? Because I'm not sure this works unless we've got the right incentives and the right flexibility in place for developers and for landowners to want to take any of this on.
Okay, thank you, Shane. Let's go to Jan. Jan, you're muted. Let's see. Jan, did you want to speak? There you go. Well, Jan, it looks like you're unmuted, but we can't hear you.
Hi, okay.
There's Jan, there you are.
Sorry about that. I had to take my laptop to the kitchen because I ran out of juice again. So I'm back. Should earned density be used to bring down comp plan density ranges? And I think it should be used for that. I think that we want to keep the density that we're looking at, even if it's WUs and that sort of thing, is still more expensive than a lot of people can afford. And what with the infrastructure yet to be built, and we've got ideas for it, but it's not there. I believe that it should be used at this point. I don't think we need to build out right away in 5 years. I think we should carefully plan to do it in a regular, careful manner. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Jan. Any other, I see, Mike Jennings. Hi, Mike.
Hi, Supervisor. On this particular question, it seems like we have the ranges in the plan, and I did a word count of the land use section, and it has 210 musts that relate to what applicants or developers must do to, you know, meet the goals of the land use plan. And it seems to me, if let's assume all 210 must stay, then those are what the developer needs to look at in order to get to the upper end of the range that's in the land use plan. And then I see earned density personally as something that if they wanted to do some of the 210 musts and then do some other things that includes earned density, then maybe they get closer to the upper range or maybe even past the upper range. But that's the way I was thinking about it.
Okay, thank you, Mike. Rich.
Hi, Supervisor. Thank you. Yeah, I just want to echo what Mike just stated. You know, it's as the loan developer on the task force and an owner of property in Reston, actively developing property, and we have other property that in the future we would like to entitle and develop in the TOD areas. It's hard. It's hard to really take the entire comp plan and understand, even at the higher end, in taking earned density out of the equation, whether we could make projects pencil at this time. And I think Mike's point on how many musts are currently in the draft of the plan, I think that's important to put into context. So it's, again, I think for me, it's hard to even answer the question because I don't even know if I could even accomplish everything, all the musts that are currently in the draft of the plan. And I think if we could, we would need the higher end of that range to accomplish, you know, what's in the comp plan, not even taking into account the earned density. And I think some of the categories in the earned density section would be very hard to achieve for a lot of projects in Reston. You know, some are not large enough to achieve some of those categories, whether it's the medical pieces of it or, you know, other categories. So as a loan developer, it's hard to answer the question right now without really understanding the costs associated with all those musts and whether we could actually pencil a project right now. So just wanted to throw that out there.
All right. Thank you, Rich.
Thank you.
Appreciate your input there. I see Tammy has her hand up.
I will comment on Mike Jennings, however many hundred musts he found. Doing a word count to me indicates sort of a sophomoric view of the land use chapter. There are residential there and with musts in it that are not going to accrue to the TSAs. Likewise, convenience centers, likewise, retail centers, et cetera, et cetera. So come on, get a grip on what the musts are all about. I find it also interesting that Reston being the gem it is, that the people that are concerned about this stymieing the plan, I find that almost ludicrous in thought. Everybody wants to come here and be here. And if you can't give back to the community a little something extra, sell your property and let somebody else do it. You know, we are burgeoning. We have no infrastructure or very little infrastructure for the development that's already been in, no money to build any of the bridges or transportation or schools or library or rec center. And the residents are sitting here going, is it a crime for developers to give back a little bit? We're not asking for the moon, but I just think this is a crazy idea. That you know, we're going to make development so tough in Reston that everybody who's a developer is going to turn tail and flee. That's ludicrous. Thank you.
All right, thank you.
Can I say one other thing?
Yeah, please.
Off subject. Thank you to David Vanel. I've done a lot of research. I was having a fit about disabled versus differently abled, and David is 100%. And I want to explain that my sensitivity to differently abled came from being roundly chastised by a group, RAC, Reston Accessibility Committee, a couple years ago. And we said handicapped or disabled and they had a stroke, and said, no, it's differently able. So the language has changed. It is now disabled is the socially correct, acceptable. My apologies for insisting on differently able. David, thank you for bringing that forward. I appreciate it. That's it.
All right, Tammy, thank you. Charles has his hand up.
Yeah,
Charles Kapoor.
Thank you, Supervisor. I'll just mention that you know, being one of the folks on this task force that represents the business community's perspective, I get a little frustrated with when a member presents an opinion and it's treated with insults and name calling. I don't seem to see that volleying on the other side. And here we have an opinion from one of our developers, and it's the dismissiveness that's passed out of hand. I agree that, Reston is a fantastic place to do business and live. That's why I've been here for half of my working career. But I do think that it merits listening to some of the feedback that's here, because this status that we have is not guaranteed forever. And when we have a developer who is mentioning the pain points that he is foreseeing with this, when he's been with this process for the 2 years that we've been part of this group, I think it's just very short-sighted, and it's been pervasive through this process, which is rather unfortunate.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that. And we do have, there any other comments? And civil comments are welcome. Thank you, Charles. Any other comments, questions, ideas on these questions?
I do have one comment, and maybe
Yes.
I'm being a little too concrete tonight. If the goal is to do what number one says, we need to have a number. So so we need to take the numbers out of that chart. Now, some would argue, well, those numbers are abstract and they're approximates, and so but those numbers are used to calculate the transportation balance. They're used to calculate the amount of rectangular fields. They're used to calculate the number of schools. So whichever way we want to go, if we want to use earned density to bring the density down, we should have a notion of how much we want to bring it down, so that we can do the rest of the real solid planning that we really should be doing.
So
That's my only.
John, if I could, just to jump on that point, I don't
Not advocating
understand.
one way or the other. I just.
I don't understand point number 1 and point number 4, because they seem to be one and the same, or maybe they're different, and I just don't understand what the difference is. When we talk about bringing it down, are we bringing it down below the bottom density range, or are we bringing it to the bottom and then working our way up? Are we trying to answer the question in number 4 in the context of number 1? And I just don't know. I don't know how these two questions, I guess, relate to one another, number 1, and number 2.
Yeah, Mark, I can, as the person that drafted these questions, I'll take a
I
shot.
think it doesn't matter that much what I think, but when I read number 1, that means you're bringing it down from the maximum.
Right.
So if we're going to do that, then you need to know how much we're bringing it down, at least in approximate terms, so we don't get off base when we do these calculations. Number 4 is just a matter of what is where do you start from?
Yeah.
Is it 50% or some other area, or is it what the zoning says? So that's the difference to me, what it is.
Right. And just as another example, I mean, for number 4, you could say, well, earned density really only applied to the higher end of the density range. So maybe it only kicks in at 75%.
Yeah, you can change
max plan density. I mean, so that's the discussion. That's kind of the question.
And that might make more sense even than the 50%, even though we suggested it before. But the range like 13 to 20, the 13 is not 50% of the upper. We probably ought to have something 70 or some other dimension. But again, the first one is about bringing it down from the maximums.
Yeah.
And the fourth one is figuring out what the lower end of the range would be.
Right. I mean,
I'm advocating one way or the other, but.
Yeah. I hear that. I guess the question is, I don't know that there's an assumption built up in there that every project that comes forward comes into the maximum into the density range. And, that's not true. You have the Seacus townhouses, you have the Toll Brothers townhouses, both of which came in at the baseline density range, not even at the redevelopment density range, right?
Right.
So, and there are other examples that have come in just based on the land area, the size of the parcel. There's a whole host of elements that go into this. I guess what the disconnect for me that I still don't understand is how this concept relates to set aside Mike's calculation of the number of musts in the plan, but how does this relate to all of the other expectations that
Yes.
we are putting into the plan? And are we setting up two different sets of criteria that projects must achieve to be able to secure a rezoning? Or is it one set of criteria and these elements are baked into the other criteria? That's the piece that's still not clear to me, is what is it we're trying to accomplish? Set aside the metrics for a second of what earned density, what the numbers are relative to earned density, but how do they relate to the other criteria that we have in the plan? And are we setting up a dueling set of criteria, or a sequential or cumulative set of criteria that have different expectations depending on, kind of, I don't even know what depending on, but like how does the base plan recommendation relate to these criteria? That's the piece I just don't understand yet.
Okay.
I
Yeah, go
could
ahead,
take a.
John. Yeah.
There's kind of two thoughts going on here, I think. And I could be wrong, but there's the thought that this is a method to bring the densities down to some other level. Probably not to the low end, but and we're going to make it difficult to get to the maximum. So that's kind of one end of the extreme. The other side of this extreme is it's written differently. This is the way you get to the maximum. We're going to make it easy to get to the maximum, but these are kind of the steps that you have to get to. And the point of that would be to make it a little easier on the negotiating side to get to the maximum. So that's kind of two ends of the extreme, I think. So the group's just got to decide where to go.
Right,
That's where
John, but let me give you an example, right? Let's assume that so Rich talked about earlier. He's got an entitlement for Halley Rise. He's got another site that doesn't yet have entitlements. It's one thing to say that it applies to the site that doesn't have the entitlements, but there's an amendment that comes forward to change a road design or to flip-flop a use or whatever it might be. The density doesn't change on the project. The total number of units, the total square footage, it's just literally flipping uses from one point to another point. In this construct, does he have to earn his way back up to the density that he already has on the project? Because we suddenly have this concept now, and so you gotta fight to get back to zero, or is it in the context of a net new development? These are the sort of implementation questions that David Gill, Shane, and I will all get asked, and I'm sorry for using Rich as an example, but these are the conversations that will be asked: is how does this work in the real world?
No, Mark, I appreciate that. That's, those are good questions. And, I hate to cut off the debate or the discussion, but it is 9:58 and we've been going almost 3 hours now. I do see a couple more hands, and let's go ahead and move forward on this. Charles, is your hand new or is that an older hand? And then David Vanel.
No, that's an older hand, Supervisor.
Okay, no problem. David Vanel.
Yes, sir. I'll try to make this quick. I shared my ideas and my thoughts and my concerns about the concept of earned density. I think, frankly, it's flawed. And I'll just make it quick. On the one hand, having sat on the P&Z for a long time and hearing developer after developer come back, and we have to ask them the same questions. We have to ask them this. Some of them have anticipated this, and now they're getting a little bit better. But I think there are things on that earned density tactics list that just should be something that is expected of a developer when it comes in. Mark doesn't want to hear that, but that's the way it is. They should come with their best design. They should come with their best architecture. They should come with some kind of LEED or green building thing. They should do stormwater management better. And I don't think we should be offering bonus density or any kind of density stipulation for them to do those kinds of things. That's what Reston expects. On the other hand, I want to make sure that, as I stated in the email, that anything that is a public policy goal of Fairfax County is protected from earned density and that shall be handled with the current concept of bonus density. And that includes affordable housing, that includes environmental protection or environmental green buildings and things like that. I think it also includes a number of different economic development factors. All of those things are public policy goals of Fairfax County. And I would not like to have those things linked with, whatever earned density is. I'm still not entirely certain what it is. I mean, I fall back on the old adage, if you can't get your idea on the back of your business card, you don't have a clear idea. And I'm sorry, but I think the earned density needs to be reconfigured. Set aside the fact that it needs a new term. It just needs to be thought through and worked in a different way, because I don't think this is going to get us where we want to go.
Well, David, that's an excellent segue. As we wrap up this discussion, I did want to let the task force know that we do need to keep moving forward with our schedule in order to get basically to wrap up this update to the comprehensive plan by the end of the year. So specifically on the earned density, I am asking 5 of you to get together as a subgroup during the next couple of months, come back to the task force after working with staff, with John Carter, with myself perhaps, and I've asked Charles Colby, Alvarez Lascend, Myra, David Gill, and Mark Looney to work on that. The comments and the points made, I think, were very good on all sides. This is something that is gonna, I think, it's gonna take some time to work out, if ever, in this context. So let's see where this goes with this group, with this subgroup over the next couple of months, and also to get some more feedback from staff on it. So thank you, everybody who has provided thoughts and input on this. There's obviously a lot to think about, and I think it does help to look at this in the totality of the recommendations of the task force. I think that is a helpful exercise that hopefully this subgroup can also do. Any questions or comments on earned density or that process going forward?
Walter, could you quickly read the names again?
Sure. Charles Colby, Alvarez Myra, David Gill, and Mark Looney.
Okay, thank you.
Yes, thank you, John. And I know
It's a great group.
Thank you. And I know some of you, Lynn, have worked incredibly hard on other chapters. So
I was
we're
just
also
trying to synthesize earned density.
trying to spread the wealth a little bit. And not that some of you on this group haven't done a lot of work as well. So,
Question, Walter.
Yes, John.
That's not about earned density.
That's fine.
So,
Just real quick
no,
before Anything else on earned density before we move on? Okay, John, go ahead.
I'm looking for all of the chapters in final form. We don't have them yet. Open space is one. I don't know what the others are, but I think it's time to put this together, isn't it? And so
Yeah.
I think it'll be
Jose,
interesting.
how are we doing? Are we close, Jose?
Yeah, we're close. I know Parks and Open Space is working to send me their draft, and transportation is very close, and
I think
actually it's done. We just need to send it out, and I'm working with John Moody to just make sure there's some context prior to sending that one out.
Land
But
use,
other than that,
I
I
don't know
think
what
Jose,
else.
if I have some edits like typos that I found, because that's what I do.
you found one
Should
today.
I let you know?
I'd be happy to take a look at those, typos
Okay,
if you
thank you.
find them. Yeah.
I will let you know. Thank you.
Okay.
All right, John Carter, anything else?
That's it.
Okay, so again, the last thing I think we had, Jose, on the agenda was, and this is very quick, and we're over 3 hours. Thank you, everybody. So the initial public engagement. So I think we've talked about that. I am open for any additional suggestions on initial public engagement, groups to talk to, communities to talk with, to get some initial feedback. I do want to underscore, Jose, I know has asked for 3 bullets from each of the chapter leads for slides. If you haven't provided those, he might be harassing you. So please do that if you haven't already. And also, Jose will be checking with you if he hasn't already about participating in some of this initial public engagement. The last thing that I'll note on public engagement is making the interim recommendations public. So basically putting it on a website. So this is something that I think is an important next step. We have, as requested, we have shared copies of drafts with people who have requested, but this, of course, makes it much more open-ended. So as soon as Jose does get, I would say, the final drafts, interim recommendations from the chapter leads, that will be put on a website. So just wanted to make sure everybody understands that. Are there any questions or concerns about that step?
Walter?
Yes, John.
Could you give the approximate time frame for both the initial outreach period and the later outreach period?
Yes, initial outreach period effectively, hopefully start maybe later this month, probably through into April. And then the task force will, I'm assuming we're going to probably need, 2 or 3 weeks, maybe 4, to work through final recommendations by the task force. So we're talking about the more in-depth public engagement starting end of May through the summer. And then public hearings, planning commission, board of supervisors in the fall.
Thank you.
Any other questions about process, anything that I just talked about? Any concerns? Okay, I don't see any, or at least I don't hear any hands. Okay, listen, thank you all. This has been a pretty intense evening, and this was meeting 45 of this task force. And that only counts the full task force meetings, doesn't count all the subgroup meetings. I don't even want to count all those, I don't think. But somebody does, let me know. But thank you so much, everyone, for your commitment. I think it really did shine through tonight in terms of how much you were thinking about this, how much you have thought about it, and how much you all care about the community. So thank you so much for putting all this time and energy into it. Any final comments, questions before we break?
I have one. I'm sorry, forgive me, but I am a bit confused. So are we coming back to do earned density? And if so,
Yes,
when are we coming back?
that will be in April. So basically, when staff provides written feedback, some of that will happen earlier during the interim period. And then final recommendations, or I guess written staff recommendations, I think that's what we're calling it, by, Jose, was it the end of March, I believe, or into April? Can't remember.
Supervisor, I'd have to look at the schedule, but I know that sometime in March, I know that if there hadn't been any high-level comments given, that was going to be given the beginning of March, and then I would say mid-April, and don't quote me, that's when they would do the annotated task force comparison.
So at that point, Michelle, it would be probably mid-April would be when I think we would expect the mid to late April when the task force would start to come back. And then hopefully we would look to have task force wrap up with final recommendations, including any recommendation on earned density in May. John?
So we are out of session until mid-April?
Yes, unless you're doing earned density subgroup. And of course, there are the other elements that we discussed tonight, like the equity review in your chapter, looking at the equity principles. And of course, anybody, and hopefully many of you will help with the initial public engagement. So it's not exactly a break. Okay, any other questions? All right, thank you, everybody. Appreciate everybody staying late tonight and appreciate everything you've been doing on this process. Have a good evening, everyone.
Thank you.
Everyone.
Thank you, Jose, and thank
Thanks,
you, Lisa.
everybody. Thanks,
Everyone.
everyone. Night.